Out front next, Republicans slamming Republicans for the stunning loss by Roy Moore. From Bannon to McConnell to Trump, who's really to blame? Plus, the Deputy Attorney General tells Congress there is no reason to fire Bob Mueller. Could Trump do it anyway? And drama at the White House. Former Apprentice star Omarosa is out, and the Secret Service is now weighing in itself. Let's go out front. Good evening, I'm Jim Sciutto, in tonight for Aaron Burnett, and out front tonight, the blame game. Republicans scrambling in the wake of Roy Moore's devastating defeat for Alabama's Senate seat are now pointing fingers at each other. A top target, Steve Bannon, who campaigned relentlessly for Moore and played a key role in convincing Trump to back an accused child molester for the Senate. Here's New York Congressman Peter King today.
This guy does not belong on the national stage. He looks like some disheveled drunk that wandered onto the political stage.
But the Bannon defenders have Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in their sights. Fox News host Sean Hannity tweeting, quote, McConnell deserves a lot of the blame for Alabama. Mo Brooks would have won by 20% of the vote, and McConnell interference hurt badly. Inside the White House, as sources tell CNN, the finger-pointing is rampant, with some Trump advisors blaming White House political director Bill Stepien. A source close to the White House says that Stepien wasn't the one who advised Trump to endorse Moore, but he failed to talk him out of the toxic endorsement. No leadership, he doesn't have any juice, one source said. Let's be clear, though. The buck stops with the president. It was Trump who went all in for Moore in the last crucial weeks of the campaign, and despite the extremely troubling allegations against Moore of making sexual advances to teenage girls. Here he is, just days before the election, rallying supporters near the Alabama border.
We cannot afford, this country, the future of this country, cannot afford to lose a seat in the very, very close United States Senate. We can't afford it, folks. We can't. So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
And then in the hours before voters went to the polls, Trump's robocall.
Hi, this is President Donald Trump, and I need Alabama to go vote for Roy Moore. We're already making America great again. I'm going to make America safer and stronger and better than ever before. But we need that seat. We need Roy voting for us.
To be clear, there is no evidence that anyone forced President Trump to hold that rally or record that robocall or tweet multiple messages of support for Roy Moore. And yet, despite a shattering loss for his party, one that a Republican official calls a wake-up call, the president is still insisting that he was right about Moore, tweeting, quote, the reason I originally endorsed Luther Strange, and his numbers went up mightily, is that I said Roy Moore will not be able to win the general election. I was right, exclamation point. Roy worked hard, but the deck was stacked against him. Jeff Zeleny is out front tonight at the White House. Jeff, the blame game there getting even more vicious tonight.
Jim, there's no question the blame game is in full force. They're finger-pointing all around here, a bit of a circular firing squad, if you will. But there's no doubt that if you simplify all of it, it really gets down to two people. We talked to many Republicans throughout the day here. The reason that President Trump got behind Roy Moore so in a full-throated manner, really increasing his support over the last several weeks, was Steve Bannon. He said that Steve Bannon, he saw him go down there. They had conversations about this, and Steve Bannon thought that Roy Moore could win. Steve Bannon was interested in picking this fight with Mitch McConnell, of course. So, in a sense, he had a different objective than the president. But there is no doubt here. The question tonight at the White House and on Capitol Hill: will the president listen to Steve Bannon in the future? What will his role be in 2018 in those midterm races? There are signs, at least early signs tonight, that Steve Bannon's wings will be clipped in some respect in terms of recruiting other candidates, because the president also tweeted today that strong candidates win elections. Roy Moore was not a strong candidate. But at the end of the day here, there is a sense of lemonade being made here, Jim, because the president reached out to Doug Jones in a phone call this afternoon shortly before that tax speech in the White House. He congratulated him for the victory. There's one reason for that, and he invited him here to the White House. They need his vote. Now it's a 51-49 split after the holiday, after the new year. And suddenly Doug Jones, the most conservative Democrat in the Senate, or at least representing the most conservative state, he could be a vote for this White House. We'll see if that actually happens. He's invited him here to the White House. Jim, that's what used to happen. I remember freshman Senator Barack Obama from Illinois being invited here to see President George W. Bush. That hasn't happened lately. We'll see if bipartisanship happens. I wouldn't count on it. Jim?
Yeah, maybe not, especially since they're trying to squeeze in that tax vote before they seat him, Jeff Zeleny, at the White House.
Sure.
And out front tonight, Gloria Borger, chief political analyst, Mark Preston, senior political analyst, and April Ryan, White House correspondent for American Urban Radio Networks. Gloria, if I could start with you, the president seems to be acting like he had nothing to do with Alabama, a little bit of revisionist history.
Right. No fingerprints here. You know, one of his early tweets was that Moore had the deck stacked against him. And of course, the president had a lot to do with it. As Jeff was pointing out, he completely endorsed Roy Moore. He took the advice of Steve Bannon. And he may actually have helped this race tighten for Roy Moore. But don't forget, even in the state of Alabama, which he won by a 2-to-1 margin, the president's approval-disapproval rating is about a tie, under 50% or so. And you had a huge turnout in this state for this kind of election, 40% turnout. And while there was passion on both sides, the people who turned out are the people Republicans and this president has to be concerned about, and that is African American voters, women, suburban women.
No question. And there was evidence of that same phenomenon, though, in a bluer state, or at least a swing state, Virginia, as well.
Yep.
Mark, regardless of the case the president is making now, and you might say a somewhat of confusing case because he gave a lot of different excuses today via Twitter and other statements, does the president own this, whether he likes it or not?
Yeah, there's no question he owns it. And what's really confounding, I think, is moving beyond the fact that he was with Mitch McConnell when they backed Luther Strange in the Republican primary. Of course, Strange loses to Moore. Moore goes on to lose last night. Is that when it got to the point of backing Judge Moore, who had numerous allegations lodged against him from women who said that he dated them when they were teenagers or that he sexually assaulted them, Donald Trump chose to break from the Republican establishment, from the Republican congressional leaders, and endorse Judge Moore. I think that is very, very hurtful now for Republicans heading into 2018. I got to tell you this, Jim. The only thing that happened that was good for Republicans in the last 24 hours is that Judge Moore lost. Because could you imagine how they would be able to deal with an election in 2018 having him as somebody that the president endorsed and he won?
No question, or being photographed with him in the Senate chambers. April, when you look at Trump's track record with who he's backed in races just in the last couple of months, let's look at the list. He backed Ed Gillespie in Virginia. That didn't work out so well. Of course, he backed Luther Strange first in the primary in Alabama, then Roy Moore, lost on both accounts. Ed Gillespie even said that Trump's support was a big factor in his loss. That is a Republican candidate for governor in Virginia saying that the president's endorsement actually hurt him. I mean, can you argue that the president's becoming more of a liability than an asset for GOP candidates?
Yes, the president is weak. He is a liability. He's weakened by the fact that Ed Gillespie, who was once in the Bush administration, once the head of the RNC, lost Virginia. Also, the two candidates that the president backed for Alabama, a sitting president is supposed to have the momentum, or in the past has had the momentum to help at least bring at least a couple of the candidates to the finish line. For this president, he is now taking an assessment of how to move forward. It does not help that Steve Bannon, who was thought to be a kingmaker, actually brought the president in on Roy Moore, and Roy Moore was another loss. So this president has to really rethink how he is pushing forward. His approval rating is down at 32%, and now he's got losses for candidates. He really has to go back and reassess and refigure how he can move forward if he's going to continue trying to back candidates.
Gloria, I wonder if some of this is somewhat predictable. As April mentioned, a 32% approval rating. I mean, the laws of gravity still apply, that an unpopular and arguably very divisive president weighs down candidates in his own party.
Sure he does. But, I mean, if you look in a state like Alabama, where his approval rating is just below 50%, that's higher than the national level, as you just said. So you would have thought that in Alabama, it might have had more weight. The problem in Alabama also was the candidate. Let's not forget. Roy Moore was a bad candidate with a bad history, and the president supported him anyway, taking his party down that road with him. I mean, the Republican National Committee went along with it. And, I think now the fight is going to be on in this Republican Party over who's going to control the future. Is it going to be Steve Bannon and Donald Trump, who sided with him, or is it going to be folks like Mitch McConnell and other Republican leaders who say you got to nominate people who can get elected?
Yeah, Mark, I have to ask you on that because it's not like the sides are backing off here. You had Steve Bannon talking today about the fight is going to continue to be vicious here. I wonder, can a divided, really more than a divided, but an internally competitive and internally angry, combative Republican Party, can it win in 2018 and 2020?
Well, it all depends where you think they can win. I think the House of Representatives is very much in danger now of going Republican. Jim, until last night, there was very little talk that Republicans could potentially take back the United States Senate. But there's a little sliver of hope now for Democrats at this point. Heading into 2020, I can't imagine that President Trump is not going to get a real primary right now. To your point, to Gloria's point, and to April's point, the party is so divided at this point, 32% approval rating nationally. With Republicans, he's probably still in the high 70s, but that's still going to tick down. I do think you're going to see a primary against President Trump heading into 2020, but they do have to deal with what's in front of them, and that's 2018, and it doesn't look good right now for Republicans.
Yeah. April, before we go tonight, there was some drama inside the White House last night. The White House announcing today that Omarosa, former contestant, of course, on The Apprentice, now was an aide to the president, leaving the administration. You have some new reporting on this.
Yeah, we found out the trigger. The trigger was that General Kelly saw Omarosa last night and wanted to talk to her about her access to the president. She continued to call the president, and it was causing a problem. And then that is where everything blew up. Apparently, she said, if I don't have full access, meaning walk-in privileges in the Oval Office to be able to go in and out of meetings as at will or as she wants, there will be, all hell will break loose. And he said, okay, all hell is going to break loose. And that's where it all started. And sources are saying it happened. It started in one of the two Christmas parties at the White House last night, and it continued on. But there's also new reporting. The White House did reach out to me. The only thing that they had a complaint about was the fact that one of the sources said that in Omarosa's aide, her assistant was fired. The assistant that they were talking about left allegedly 3 months ago. The other one is still there. And then the Secret Service has come out saying that they were not involved in escorting Omarosa Manigault out of the White House. So who did? And also they said they did deal with the deactivation. They deactivated her hard pass to get in and out of the White House. So she's supposed to stay until January 20th. Her hard pass has been deactivated. We'll see if she comes back.
That does not sound like a friendly departure at all. Thanks very much, April Ryan, for that new reporting.
Not at all.
Out front next, Roy Moore is still not conceding while the rest of his party, rest of the country, rest of the state moves on. Plus, Robert Mueller's boss says the special counsel has done nothing to warrant his dismissal. But could Trump fire him anyway? And Republicans rushing to pass a tax plan before Doug Jones takes his Senate seat. The new tax deal making the rich even richer. New tonight, Roy Moore refusing to concede despite his stunning loss in Alabama's special election against Doug Jones. Moore not ready to congratulate Jones on his win, even though he lost by nearly 21,000 votes. That is 1.5 percentage points. And Jones tonight with this message.
Do the right thing, Roy. It's time that we heal. It's time that we get together.
Out front, Margaret Hoover. She is former George W. Bush White House staff and veteran of 2 presidential campaigns. And Amy Kramer. She is co-chair for Women for Trump, and she endorsed Roy Moore. Amy, Roy Moore showing, again, no sign tonight that he is ready to pack it in. On what basis is he holding out?
You know, Jim, I honestly have no idea. I haven't talked to him or anyone with the campaign. And earlier today, we called on him to concede the race. We think it's time to put this behind us and move on. I think that everyone else has, and the people of Alabama and the rest of the country are ready to do so. So we do think he should concede.
Margaret, I want to go to the broader implications of this race. The allegations against Moore certainly hurt Moore when it came to women. Look at some of these numbers here. Women with children made up 1 in 5 voters in Alabama, and Jones had 66% of their vote to Moore's 32%. That's 2 to 1. And when you look at how black women voted, it just overwhelming. 98% voted for Jones, just 2% voted for Moore. Fact is, beyond this race, if you look at Virginia as well, the numbers in suburban women voters for the Democrat over the Republican there, in your view, is the Republican Party led by President Trump irreparably damaged when it comes to women voters?
You raise a very, very good question that I seriously hope Republican leaders, really the elected leaders of this party in Washington, are really taking very seriously tonight. Certainly, there has been a cascading effect after the Women's March, after the loss of Hillary Clinton, but this seems to be reaching a new level because of the allegations of Harvey Weinstein, because of the sort of tipping point and the awakening and the awareness that people across the country have with respect to sexual harassment, sexual assault, and these issues as they've catapulted. Certainly, this election was not a referendum on any of those issues related specifically to women, but it played a significant factor in the confluence of issues that put the first Democrat in 25 years over the top in Alabama.
Amy, I wonder what your answer is to that. I mean, this is the reddest of red states. It has to be a danger sign for Republicans writ large, but particularly when it comes to women voters.
Well, what I would say to that is it's kind of like Scott Brown in 2009, 2010. This seat is only going to be held up through 2020, and then I do think a Republican will come in and take the seat. Look, there was a lot more. I'm not saying that the allegations didn't play into it. Don't get me wrong. I think that they probably did. But this was a flawed candidate, and there was no campaign. I am not aware of any get out the vote effort, and we all know that with elections, it's the science of addition. And when you are only looking at your base and not trying to reach anybody else, when you are leaving town Thursday, Friday, and Saturday before Election Day to go to an Army-Navy game, there's a serious problem there.
Your group endorsed Moore for the Senate. Why didn't you express these reservations during the race?
We originally endorsed Mo Brooks. We got behind Mo Brooks early on. But I want to say this.
But
that
fact is, before Election Day, you put your stamp of approval on Roy Moore.
We did. We endorsed him when he was in the runoff with Luther Strange. We did. But I want to say this, that the Republicans still control the White House, the Senate, and the House, and we still control the majority of governorships across the nation. So while everything may seem doom and gloom, we have won 5 special elections in the House. We've lost 1 Senate race. I mean, it's very reminiscent
of
the
race in Virginia, and the Virginia House, the Virginia State House went almost flipped from a 2-to-1 advantage.
This is very reminiscent of when the Tea Party movement started, and I'm not surprised that they have momentum and energy on their side. You know, it's to be expected, but the important thing here is that the GOP takes this and learns from it. That's what's important going forward.
Margaret, I know you want to pipe in. What's your response?
Well, the question, I think Amy and I would probably suggest that there are fundamentally different lessons to learn from this experience. And I think the lesson that needs the most obvious one that is true to all of us is this is a major repudiation. And this just isn't just about women, Jim. This is about women voters. That's a part of it. This is a repudiation of Bannon, of Trump, of this play to the base, divisive. I mean, the way Roy Moore won, by the way, he was running for decency, for common ground, for getting things done in Washington. This Republican president with the unified Republican control, as Amy pointed out, hasn't gotten anything done. And the tax bill that they're about to get done, it fundamentally undermines everything Republicans have stood for the last 25 years or 30 years since Ronald Reagan. So the issue is this is a repudiation of Bannon. This is a repudiation of this idea that you can take over the Republican Party with white nationalism, with, you know, veiled racism, and it should give the leaders of the party, Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, people who have stood for fundamentally different things for as long as I've been a Republican, pause, that they should find some moral courage and moral decency, that they should not check for political expediency or what they think is short-term political expediency, their values, because they need to offer something to Republicans that we can be proud of moving forward, and that was not this.
Margaret, well, quick thought before we go.
No, I was just going to say, I completely disagree with you. We control the Senate and the House because President Trump he won that election overwhelmingly. And the reason he hasn't gotten a lot of his agenda done is not because he hasn't tried, but because of lack of leadership, especially in the United States Senate. And let's remind everybody, Mitch McConnell had his choice, Marco Rubio, Pat Toomey, Ted Cruz would not be in the United States Senate.
We're gonna have to leave it there. Both of you, thanks very much. Out front next, should Robert Mueller be fired from the Russia probe? His boss says absolutely not.
It would be very difficult, Congressman, for anybody to find somebody better qualified for this job.
And the Republicans reach a deal on tax reform. The details just stunning. Last-minute changes making the rich even richer. Breaking news, Donald Trump Jr. exiting a marathon session with the Senate Intelligence Committee just moments ago. Trump Jr. ignoring shouted questions about whether he refused to answer questions. Inside, the president's eldest son back on Capitol Hill 1 week after he met with the House Intelligence Committee. All this about his controversial Trump Tower meeting during the campaign with a Russian lawyer who was offering damaging information on Hillary Clinton, as well as about his contacts with WikiLeaks. Senator Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the committee, telling CNN that he wants Trump Jr. to come back again, saying, quote, "I still have more questions. When we're talking about the principles, the members are going to want to hear from him directly." Also tonight, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein making it clear that he sees no good cause to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller, this during a heated hearing on Capitol Hill, in the face of a concerted Republican effort to discredit Mueller. Laura Jarrett is out front tonight.
Tonight, a top Justice Department official coming to the defense of the special counsel he appointed to lead the Russia investigation, amid claims Robert Mueller's team is biased.
I think it would be very difficult, Congressman, for anybody to find somebody better qualified for this job. Director Mueller has, throughout his lifetime, been a dedicated and respected and heroic public servant. Based upon his reputation, his service, his patriotism, and his experience with the department and with the FBI, I believe he was an ideal choice for this task.
While President Donald Trump has called the investigation a witch hunt, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein told House lawmakers today that no one has asked him to fire Mueller.
I am not going to be discussing my communications with the president, but I can tell you that nobody has communicated to me a desire to remove Robert Mueller.
Rosenstein batted away claims the probe is stacked against the president, as Republican lawmakers pointed to donations Mueller's team members made to Democrats over the years.
How, with a straight face, can you say that this group of Democrat partisans are unbiased and will give President Trump a fair shake?
And to newly disclosed text messages between two top officials at the FBI.
This is unbelievable. And I'm here to tell you, Mr. Rosenstein, I think the public trust in this whole thing is gone.
The messages show FBI lawyer Lisa Page and counterintelligence agent Peter Strzok trashing Trump throughout the 2016 presidential campaign. Page texting in March 2016 after a primary debate, "This man cannot be president." Strzok saying in another, "God, Hillary should win 100 million to 0. Strzok led the FBI's investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server, which closed without any criminal charges and was later part of the FBI's investigation into contacts between Russian operatives and Trump campaign associates.
So he's openly pulling for the candidate he had a role in clearing, and he's openly investigating a candidate that he has bias against.
When we have evidence of any inappropriate conduct, we're going to take action on it. And that's what Mr. Mueller did here. As soon as he learned about this issue, he took action.
Rosenstein went on to later distinguish between a legitimate political affiliation on the one hand and pure bias on the other, saying that both he and Mueller recognize that they have employees with different political viewpoints, and it's their responsibility to make sure that those opinions don't influence their actions. Jim?
Laura Jarrett in Washington. Out front now, Congressman Jerry Nadler of New York. He is the ranking Democrat on the House Judiciary Committee, which of course held today's hearing with the Deputy Attorney General. Thanks very much, Congressman, for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
You heard those words there in the room, Rosenstein saying there are no grounds for firing Mueller. I wonder if you read that to some degree as a message to the president.
Well, I think what Mueller said was completely correct. The Republicans, really in a conspiracy, I think, led by Fox News, the Republicans on the Judiciary Committee, many others, and the White House have been carrying on a concerted campaign to discredit the special prosecutor, to discredit the FBI, the Justice Department, and anybody threatening the president or getting in his way. And I think that today's hearing was part of that. And Mueller very correctly said that nothing that they were talking about is any grounds for firing the Counsel Mueller, and that there's no evidence that he or anybody with him has done anything improper whatsoever.
You mentioned those comments from your Republican colleagues about Mueller. Here are some of them so our viewers can hear.
How with a straight face can you say that this group of Democrat partisans are unbiased and will give President Trump a fair shake?
This is unbelievable. And I'm here to tell you, Mr. Rosenstein, I think the public trust in this whole thing is gone.
What do you have to see in terms of the actions of people with demonstrated bias against the President of the United States before you will appoint a special counsel to investigate the clear bias that has infected this investigation?
Republican members there on point. Are you concerned that they're laying the political groundwork for the president to fire Mueller?
Oh, I'm very concerned about that. I think that they are trying to do exactly that with completely bogus facts and reasoning. The fact that someone has a personal political opinion is irrelevant. The fact that an FBI agent may have contributed to a Democrat or a Republican in the past is irrelevant. In fact, Congressman Lieu brought out the fact that I think it was Director Wray of the FBI and Mueller himself had given thousands of dollars in contributions to Republicans. And some of their subordinates have given contributions to Democrats, all of which is irrelevant as long as you have an unbiased investigation. Personal political opinions, everybody has personal political opinions, and the political opinions expressed by Agent Strzok that they were talking about are opinions that were shared by probably a majority of the American people.
Yeah, and we should note that Bob Mueller himself, a lifelong Republican, and he's, of course, at the top of the investigation. Now, you mentioned those anti-Trump text messages, which are the basis of this criticism there, and it caused Mueller to, in effect, fire this FBI agent to take him off the investigation. Rosenstein explained in his testimony, I suppose, a point that you were trying to make here, that political opinion does not equal bias. Here's how he explained it.
We recognize we have employees with political opinions, and it's our responsibility to make sure those opinions do not influence their actions. Pardon me. And so I believe that Director Mueller understands that and that he is running that office appropriately.
The trouble is making that argument in the current environment when it's so polarized. I mean, you heard your colleagues there today. Is that argument going to fly?
Well, that argument is going to fly because it's a true argument. People have opinions. Police officers have opinions. FBI agents have opinions. And if they express it in private emails to their girlfriends or their wives or their friends, that's irrelevant. You have to, if you want to say that the investigation is biased, you have to show some bias. And what we really see here is a concerted effort to discredit the FBI, to discredit the special investigator, to discredit the press. All in the service of eliminating a threat to the president as he feels the wall's closing in on him.
Congressman Nadler, thanks very much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Out front next, fast track for the GOP tax plan. Now that there's an apparent deal, President Trump's in a big rush to make it law.
We want to give you, the American people, a giant tax cut for Christmas.
And a CNN exclusive, new allegations against an embattled member of Congress tonight. This time, it's a male ex-staffer making the damning claims. Can Congressman Blake Farenthold continue to hold his job? New tonight, Republicans make a deal. GOP lawmakers in the House and Senate reaching a tentative compromise on the party's sweeping tax reform plan, now racing to pass it before Democrat Doug Jones is seated. The plan will lower the corporate tax rate dramatically to 21% from 35%. It also lowers the top rate for individuals to 37% from 39.6%. Translation, big break for the wealthy. Still, President Trump today insisted the plan will give the average American family a massive tax break, fulfilling a major campaign promise.
We're just days away, I hope, you know what that means, right? From keeping that promise and delivering a truly amazing victory for American families. We want to give you, the American people, a giant tax cut for Christmas. And when I say giant, I mean giant.
Front now, former senior economic advisor to the Trump campaign, Stephen Moore. He is an informal advisor to the White House now on tax policy, and former labor secretary under President Bill Clinton, Robert Reich. His new movie, Saving Capitalism, is on Netflix now. Secretary, if I could begin with you. President Trump, as you heard there, says this tax deal, giant tax cut, big gift for Christmas. You say?
No, there won't be anything under the tree for the average working family. Will see nothing in its stocking, maybe even a little tiny lump of coal, Jim. And by 2025, according to almost every study that has looked at this, that little lump of coal for the average family, the average working family in the middle, is going to be much, much larger. The big beneficiaries are people at the top, and also large corporations, and people at the top, because they own most of large corporations, are going to get a double break.
Steve, I want to give you a chance to push back. I just want to put some statistics up on the screen because it's confusing for people to understand this. This is from the Joint Committee on Taxation. By 2019, you have 1/3 of the country with little or no change in their taxes. 2021, you see it rising there. By 2027, 2/3 of Americans really aren't getting much at all. So how do you argue, how do you support the president's argument that this is a big gift to middle-class families?
Well, Jim, I mean, people are going to really feel it right away. In fact, you know, one of the announcements that Donald Trump made in that press conference that you just played a clip from was he said that, you know, the IRS is going to change the withholding tables right away so that by February of this year, people are going to start to feel the effect of this. Now, my friend Robert Reich.
Yeah, but you need a tax cut for the withholding to make a difference. You need an actual tax cut. It's got to, you know, you got to be paying less tax to the government.
Hey, well, this is my point. That you know, Robert Reich says these are little lumps of coal. No, actually, the average family, if you make, let's say, 2 earners and you make between, say, $60,000 and $100,000, you're going to see about $2,500 to $3,000 off your taxes. Now, maybe that's not a lot for Robert Reich, but for a lot of families that are struggling to pay their bills, that's a lot. Now,
Secretary Reich, on those numbers, because the numbers are key, and people at home, they're hearing numbers coming from both sides. Like one side says a few $1,000s, another side says a few $100s. Is it correct, as Stephen Moore says, that a family in that kind of is going to get $2,500? Because I've seen estimates that show it's just a few $100s.
No, I look at there are estimates. You're absolutely right, Jim. They're all over the place, but you have to trust at least the Congressional Budget Committee, the Joint Tax Committee. You've got to trust, you know, the tax policy group. I mean, there are reputable groups that have looked at this very, very carefully. Some of them are right there in Congress, and nobody has found a big tax cut for the average family, the middle class or working class family. At most, they've found maybe a couple of $100. And Steve Moore, you know, don't go into ad hominem attacks on how much money I am going to save or you're going to save. I mean, the question is this good for the country? The way you build an economy is not through trickle-down economics. The way you build an economy is through investing in education and healthcare and also the productivity of average people and in infrastructure. You make people more productive. Instead of trickle-down economics, it's rising up economics, and that's how you do it. We know this. We know this from history.
One thing for Stephen, but just to tee it up, is that at the end of the day, if I'm sitting at home and watching this, I mean, corporations get a cut from 35 to 21%. I mean, that's a big cut, right? I mean, that's not a few $100s. We're talking hundreds and hundreds and millions and billions of dollars. How do for Americans at home, how is that going to benefit them directly?
Well, this was always the centerpiece of the plan. It was trying to help American businesses be more competitive, Jim. And how do every American company is competing in a global marketplace. We have the highest statutory tax rates in the world, so we're up at 35%, and most of the rest of the world's at closer to 20%. That's just un-American.
Why not just call it a corporate tax cut plan rather than a cut for middle-class families?
Well, that's a good question. We wanted to help businesses, and by the way, Robert Rice, what's wrong with helping American businesses become competitive? Whether it's Microsoft or Apple or it's Federal Express or any of these great companies, so they can hire more workers. You need healthy companies to have good jobs. I mean, it's that simple. And by the way, one other quick thing.
If they were actually going to hire people, I'd go along with this.
Bob, let me just say one thing. There are 26.5 million small businesses in this country, and as you know, you were the labor secretary, 60% of Americans are hired by small businesses. We provide a big tax cut for the small businesses too, so that they can hire more workers.
Stephen Moore, because we're running out of time, Robert, you get the last word.
Let me just say, we have now in this country corporations, most of them big corporations, they are making more money than ever before in history. They don't know what to do with all the money they are making. They are buying their own shares of stock. They are buying other companies. They are inflating executive pay. There is no trickle down. If you give them more tax cuts, they're just going to be more involved in buying back their shares of stock. And most of that is going to go to executives.
Robert, why
and it's going to go to mergers and acquisitions.
Why is it every other country in the world has cut their tax rates?
Absolutely. This is what the effective tax rate in the United States is as just competitive. Why do you say American companies are not competitive?
Unfortunately,
they are enormously competitive.
We're going to make them more competitive.
Moore, we're going to have to leave it there, but I appreciate it. We squeezed a lot into our minutes there. Thanks to both of you, as always. Out front next, breaking news. New allegations tonight against Congressman Blake Farenthold. That is tonight. He is accused of abusive, sexist, vulgar behavior by a male ex-staffer. This is a CNN exclusive. And more on Omarosa, the woman viewers love to hate on Trump's apprentice, all of a sudden leaving her White House job. Why? Breaking news, a former male aide to Republican Congressman Blake Farenthold, the same congressman involved in a secret $84,000 sexual harassment settlement, is accusing him of making lewd and abusive comments. Michael Ricola, a former communications director, now approaching the House Ethics Committee to share his account. We should warn you, this story is graphic. It has many graphic details. MG Lee is out front with a CNN exclusive. So, MJ, what exactly is he alleging?
Well, Jim, we're hearing a new damning account from a former senior Capitol Hill aide who describes an intensely hostile environment inside the office of Texas Congressman Blake Farenthold. 31-year-old Michael Ricola was Farenthold's communications director in 2015, and he tells me that the congressman, who is a Republican, was verbally abusive, made sexually demeaning comments and jokes, and regularly berated his staff. Now, here's one especially egregious comment that Ricola says the congressman made. In July 2015, Ricola was getting ready to leave town for his wedding, and he says that Farenthold, in front of other staffers, used a crude term for performing oral sex, telling him, quote, "Better have your fiance do that before she walks down the aisle. It will be the last time." Ricola also says that Farenthold then joked about whether Ricola's now wife could wear white on her wedding day, a clear reference to whether she had premarital sex. Now, another former Farenthold staffer, Elizabeth Peace, tells me that she was there and remembers Farenthold making the crude oral sex comment. The congressman tells CNN that that part is untrue. And another disturbing detail, Jim, is that Ricola tells me the Congressman Farenthold regularly referred to aides as a profanity that will shorthand on air as F-tards. Ricola said, quote, "Every time he didn't like something, he would call me a F-tard or idiot. He would slam his fist down in rage and explode in anger. He was flying off the handle on every little thing. I couldn't find a way to control him." In this instance, the congressman acknowledged to CNN that he did regularly call his aides F-tards. Farenthold said the offensive word was used, quote, "in jest, not in anger, and in hindsight, I admit it wasn't appropriate." Now, Ricola described the 9 months that he worked at Farenthold's office as the darkest period of his life. And because of the intense stress, at one point, he says he had chronic stomach pains and was vomiting daily. I should also note that we have interviewed Ricola's wife, his friends and colleagues, and have reviewed medical records, photos, correspondence, and notes in Ricola's own journal that support this story. Jim?
Now, Farenthold, he's already under an ethics investigation, so how would these new allegations factor in? Would they also fall under a new investigation?
Well, that's right, Jim. The House Ethics Committee is already investigating the congressman and whether he sexually harassed another former aide, Lauren Green. Now, what's potentially significant here is that Ricola told CNN exclusively that he reached out to the House Ethics Committee last week and has volunteered to help with their ongoing investigation. But because the committee typically does not comment on existing investigations, it did not comment for this story. And if I could just pull all of this in, put all of this in broader context, Ricola's decision to speak out to CNN makes him a rare male staffer to come forward with allegations of misconduct against a member of Congress, because most of the people who have come forward to say Me Too so far have been women, even though aides say that Capitol Hill can be a hostile workplace for both women and men. And Ricola tells me that he hopes his story can, at the very least, shed some light on the fact that anyone can be the subject of sexual harassment or bullying on Capitol Hill. He told me, quote, "I want staffers on Capitol Hill to know that they're not alone."
MJ Lee, thanks very much for that reporting. Out front next, Omarosa is out and the Secret Service is weighing in. Just in tonight, Omarosa is out, and in an unusual move, the U.S. Secret Service is taking to Twitter to say they did not physically remove her from the White House. Tom Foreman is out front.
On the president's former TV show, she was the player people love to hate. Confrontational, controversial, and finally canned.
Omarosa, go out and sell paintings or whatever the hell you're doing. You're fired.
Now it's happened again. Just months after she married and led her 39-person wedding party on a tour of the White House, described as disruptive at best, she's resigning from the administration. At least that's the official story, and CNN has found nothing to disprove it. But various other media outlets say she was flatly fired and escorted off the grounds amid profanities.
He has to defend his wife just as strongly as he will defend this nation.
It's a big come down for a woman who fiercely fought all critics of Donald Trump on his way up, and as president, too.
Joy, I know it's got to be really, really hard after, the last year and a half of all the things that you said about Donald to see him sitting in the Oval Office.
Every critic, every detractor will have to bow down to President Trump. It is the ultimate revenge to become the most powerful man in the universe.
Look at my African American over here. Look at him.
Part of Omarosa's role seemed to be answering all those bitter accusations that he was too cozy with racists, too distant from minorities.
And I did my best to try to keep this as civil as possible.
But her vigorous defense often tilted into shouting, as it did during this convention for black journalists. She never backed down.
I now work for this country, and I take my job very seriously.
Maybe so, but others did not, especially after Chief of Staff John Kelly took over. That, according to a former administration official who told CNN, people have long been unsure what she did at the White House, what value she brought. Many of her colleagues are elated at news of her departure.
This business of leaving after a year in office is not really that strange. But sources say she had very little contact with the president, even as her season was being canceled. Jim?
Tom Foreman, thank you, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jim Sciutto. AC 360 starts right now.
Good evening. We begin tonight keeping them honest with the president offering a number of excuses for why Roy Moore lost in Alabama, none of them assigning any blame to the candidate being an alleged sex offender or to the president's own endorsement of him. The loss is a significant one, of course. For the first time in 25 years, Alabama, among the reddest of the red states, has elected a Democrat, Doug Jones, to the United States Senate. Alabama overwhelmingly voted for President Trump last year. Roy Moore has not conceded the election, we should point out. He says when the vote is this close, it's not over. When the news broke last night that Jones had won, the president tweeted this: "Congratulations to Doug Jones on a hard-fought victory. The write-in votes played a very big factor, but a win is a win. The people of Alabama are great, and the Republicans will have another shot at this seat in a very short period of time. It never ends." Which is, fair to say, a quite gracious tweet from the President of the United States. Then came the tweet this morning, quote, "The reason I originally endorsed Luther Strange and his numbers went up mightily is that I said Roy Moore will not be able to win the general election. I was right. Roy worked hard, but the deck was stacked against him." Now, it is true that the president originally endorsed Luther Strange. That part of the tweet is true, and it's worth noting that after Strange lost, the president deleted a bunch of tweets that supported Strange. And that's pretty much what we're seeing here. The president trying to distance himself now from his own endorsement, saying he always thought Moore couldn't win, and as only President Trump can do, twist this major loss into some personal victory of being right. Now, you might remember he said something similar when, after months of questioning President Obama's birthplace, then Mr. Obama produced his birth certificate. Mr. Trump congratulated himself. Now, if the president didn't think Moore would be able to win, he could have done a lot of other things. He could have not weighed in. He could have, as the White House initially and repeatedly said, left it to the voters of Alabama to decide. He could have stayed out of it, especially after the child molestation accusation made an endorsement politically treacherous. He could have called for Moore to step aside like many of his fellow Republicans did. But no, the president did not stay out of it. He did not offer some passive endorsement. He went all in. He tweeted at least 5 times dating back to Moore's primary win. Roy, win in December. He will help to make America great again. We need Republican Roy Moore to win. And twice in the last 5 days, vote Roy Moore in all caps. And he endorsed him on camera. This was the first time back in November.
I can tell you for a fact, we do not need somebody that's going to be bad on crime, bad on borders, bad with the military, bad for the Second Amendment.
Mr. President, is an accused child molester better than a Democrat? Is an accused
Well, he
child
denies
molester
it.
better
Look,
than
he
a
denies it.
Well, last week he said this about Moore's chances.
I think he's going to do very well. We don't want to have a liberal Democrat in Alabama, believe me.
The president did not campaign in Alabama, but he got about as close to Alabama as you can get without actually being in Alabama. At a campaign-style rally in Pensacola, about 15 miles from the Alabama border, the president said this.
We cannot afford, this country, the future of this country, cannot afford to lose a seat in the very, very close United States Senate. We can't afford it, folks. So get out and vote for Roy Moore. Do it. Do it.
Well, the president also made a robocall for Roy Moore.
Hi, this is President Donald Trump, and I need Alabama to go vote for Roy Moore. It is so important. Roy Moore is the guy we need to pass our Make America Great Again agenda. Roy is a conservative who helped me steer this country back on track after 8 years of the Obama disaster. Get out and vote for Roy Moore.
The president can try to rewrite, retweet, or reimagine history, but his ringing endorsements of Roy Moore, they can't be erased. Senator-elect Doug Jones says he's gotten calls from his future colleagues in Washington on both sides of the aisle, and also a congratulations call from the president. I want to get the latest now from the White House and CNN's Jim Acosta. Do we know what the president said to Senator-elect Jones?
Well, all we know is what we heard from Doug Jones earlier today at his press conference, that this was a gracious call, that the president invited him over to the White House, and that they talked about finding common ground sometime in the future when Doug Jones gets to Washington. Anderson, if they can find common ground after that election, that will be a welcome sight here in Washington, because there's not much of that these days.
In terms of finger pointing, how much is Steve Bannon on the receiving end of any of that right now?
Anderson, there's plenty. And I will tell you, I talked to a senior GOP congressional source earlier today who said that this was devastating for the White House, but even more so for Steve Bannon, that his credibility is, quote, shot up on Capitol Hill. And of course, this is a critical time, not only for the president, but for Steve Bannon, because Steve Bannon had this idea, this dream of going against the GOP establishment in 2018. The Republican Party is now basically telling him, no, that's not going to happen. But interestingly, Anderson, I talked to a Republican source close to the White House this evening who said that Steve Bannon is taking this hard, that he took it hard, what happened last night in Alabama, and that he is going around telling people today, well, the establishment was just against Roy Moore, that everybody was out to get Roy Moore. That is the public face that he's putting out there, but privately, he took it hard, according to the source I talked to just a little while ago, Anderson.
All right, Jim Acosta, appreciate it from the White House. Thanks very much, Jim. Just before air, I spoke with Senator Bernie Sanders about Jones's win in Alabama and about a tentative deal on the tax plan struck by House and Senate Republicans. Senator Sanders, Doug Jones's win, I'm wondering what you think it means for the Democratic Party, especially as we look ahead to 2018.
I think it's very significant, not only because his victory in itself is important, and Doug Jones coming to the Senate is very important. What Alabama was about last night was a tremendous amount of energy and a very high turnout. What I have always believed is when people are prepared to get involved in the political process, stand up and fight, there's nothing that we cannot do. And against all of the odds, Jones won because there was a very, very large turnout. Anderson, you'll recall that the Alabama election officials were talking about a 25% turnout. It turned out to be close to 40%. The African-American turnout was extraordinary. When people stand up and fight back, you can win even in a conservative state like Alabama. We can do this all over America. That is what we've got to do.
There are some who say, though, you can't read too much into it, that the race was an anomaly because the kind of candidate Roy Moore was. I mean, it's not every day you have a candidate that's been accused of child abuse, child molestation.
Yeah, I think there is truth to that. On the other hand, if you look at what happened on November 7th, all across this country, you saw high voter turnouts, you saw people running for office who never ran before, young people, working people, who are prepared to stand up and say Trump's vision for America is not our vision. And last night was a defeat for Trump. November 7th was a defeat for Trump. And I think if we can mobilize the American people to demand that we have a government that works for all of us and not just the 1%, that we end the kind of divisiveness that Trump has been advocating, I think we can win tremendous victories in 2018.
You know, you talked about the support from the African-American community, which was obviously played a big role in Jones's win. We heard last night from a number of people. Charles Barkley was a supporter of Doug Jones' campaign for him, Bakari Sellers on our broadcast, who said the National Democratic Party has taken African-American voters, their support for granted, and that Doug Jones didn't do that he laid a foundation, that he has been doing the work for years and years and years. Do you think that's true, that nationally the Democratic Party, in particularly in maybe southern states, but has taken African Americans for granted?
I think there is significant truth to that. I think also there is another truth, is that, in my view, too much of Democratic Party money has gone to consultants, maybe too much to TV advertising, and not enough to grassroots get out the vote, organizing, getting into the communities. And it seems to me that what Jones did, working with the African-American leadership in the state of Alabama, is do grassroots activism, get people knocking on doors, going door to door, explaining to the people the importance of that election. That is what we've got to do all over the country.
I want to ask you about the tax bill, because we're learning more details about this consensus bill between House and Senate Republicans. The corporate tax rate will go down from 35% to 21%, a slight uptick from the Senate bill. It will also include a major tax cut for upper-income households. Does any of this surprise you at all?
No. Look, Anderson, let us be clear. This tax bill was written for wealthy Republican campaign contributors. There were some 5,000 lobbyists here in Washington, D.C. working on this bill. In the Senate bill, I haven't seen the full bill yet, the new bill. In the Senate bill, 62% of the tax benefits went to the top 1%, 42% went to the top 0.1%. Meanwhile, in 10 years, in the Senate bill, 83 million middle-class families are going to be paying more in taxes. This is an absurd piece of legislation. At a time of massive income and wealth inequality, what we need to do is pay attention to the middle class and working families, not to the billionaire class.
Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, your colleague, calling for Doug Jones to be seated before the vote on the tax bill. Is that at all realistic? Because, I mean, all indications are the vote could happen as soon as next week.
Well, listen, the Republicans are trying to push this thing forward as quickly as possible. As you may know, they have not had one public hearing on it. They want to do it before the American people fully understand how bad this piece of legislation is. Now, the precedent here is that when Scott Brown of Massachusetts was elected to replace the late Ted Kennedy, he was allowed to participate in voting on the Affordable Care Act. That's the precedent there. And I think Schumer is exactly right in saying that Mitch McConnell should give Doug Jones the same opportunity. This is an important piece of legislation. The people of Alabama voted for a Senate candidate who said he would oppose this legislation. Their voices should be heard in this debate.
But, I mean, even if Roy Moore had been elected, he wouldn't have been seated until late December, early January as well, right? So, I mean, you know,
yeah, but
it's fair to say politics are at play here.
Yeah, but the point is, you don't have to move this bill as quickly as they are moving it. They are moving this at lightning speed because they don't want the American people to know what's in it. The other point to be made here is while they're moving so quickly on giving tax breaks to billionaires and large corporations, they have not yet gotten around to the Children's Health Insurance Program. 9 million children on that program, low-income, working-class kids who get their health care through that program, yet the Republicans have not had the time to reauthorize that bill and refund that bill. Community health centers, 27 million people get their health care through community centers. That bill expired at the end of the fiscal year. Republicans are very busy giving tax breaks to billionaires, not so concerned about the needs of working families getting the health care they need.
Let me ask you about the tweet that the president sent out about Senator Gillibrand yesterday, that she was begging for campaign contributions and, quote, would do anything for them. The White House insists it was not sexist at all. I wonder how you read it.
Look, Anderson, what can you say? I mean, what can we say about this president? I think you got a president who has some very serious emotional problems. To say that about a female United States senator is obscene. It is absurd. Everybody knows exactly what he meant.
Lastly, there has been a growing number of your Democratic colleagues who called for President Trump's resignation over allegations of sexual assault. I know you haven't gone that far in the past. I wonder, are you willing to go that far now? Do you think the president should resign?
No, look, that's what I said. What I said, you know, when Al Franken announced that he was going to resign, and I was asked on a TV show my view, I said, look, Franken apologized for what he did. What he did was inappropriate. He apologized for it. And then he said, I think I have to resign. You got a president who has been accused by many, many women of harassment, to say the least. This is a guy who was on a tape seen by everybody in America, essentially bragging about his sexual assault of women. Do I think under those considerations of Al Franken resign, do I think the president should resign? I do. Do I think he will? I don't. But yes, I do think he should resign.
Senator Bernie Sanders, appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Roy Moore's loss is, as we mentioned, a blow to Steve Bannon, who campaigned for him in Alabama many times. One Republican congressman today said Bannon looks like a disheveled drunk who wandered onto the national stage and doesn't belong there. That's from a Republican congressman. We'll talk to the panel about that and what Doug Jones' win means going forward next. And later, Omarosa out at the White House. Reports of major drama playing out as the former Apprentice contestant Omarosa Manigault Newman leaves her mysteriously undefined White House job suddenly. What we know about her resignation still to come. Moore is not conceding the election for a U.S. Senate seat. He told supporters when the vote is this close, it's not over. Alabama's Secretary of State says it's highly unlikely that Jones wouldn't be certified as the winner. Here's the Secretary on CNN's New Day.
I know a lot of people would say it's never over till it's over, but the margin of victory for Doug Jones at this particular time looks like a very difficult amount of votes to overcome. I think the people of Alabama wanted to make sure that their voice was heard and that their votes were counted, and that's the reason they voted in a record number in this special election.
Well, the loss certainly isn't just for Moore. You could say it's also for the president, his former chief strategist Steve Bannon, who campaigned for Moore. Today, New York Republican Congressman Peter King said Bannon does not represent anything he stands for as a conservative.
It's not even so much as a political issue, almost as a moral issue. This guy does not belong on the national stage. He looks like some disheveled drunk that wandered onto the political stage.
Joining me now is former Romney campaign advisor Stuart Stevens and CNN political commentators Mary Catherine Ham and Jack Kingston. Stuart Stevens, I mean, you heard what Congressman King say. I don't know if you want to comment on his characterization, but just in general about what King is saying about Steve Bannon and his role in the Republican Party. How do you see it moving forward?
Well, look, I think Steve Bannon made the mistake that a lot of people do when they first get involved in politics and they end up working for a campaign that wins. You think that people voted for you and not the candidate. That's not the case. I mean, this was particularly toxic in Alabama, where Bannon took the stage. I mean, you had a guy in Roy Moore, who came across as kind of a creepy guy, and you combine him with Bannon, who comes across as a creepy guy with a drinking problem. And I mean, they might as well ended up driving around the state in a panel van with free candy on the side. It just was daring people in Alabama not to vote for him, and enough took them up on their dare.
Well,
Jack?
But on the other hand, and I know Stuart would agree with this, if you think about James Carville, he started wearing blue jeans everywhere he went, and then suddenly every consultant that I met for the next 10 years wore blue jeans. So consultants kind of like that disheveled, outsider kind of hip look. But I think the substance of the matter is that he picked the wrong candidate. He should have done proper opposition research and saw this guy was sitting on an explosion, and that's what happened.
Mary Catherine, there was another GOP congressional source telling CNN, referring to Steve Bannon, saying his credibility is shot. Do you think that's true, or do you think it's too broad?
Look, I think it took a hit. Well, anytime you lose, that'll take a hit. Although, as we know, many political consultants lose many, many times and still are not out of the game. I think there will be an audience for Bannonism. And I think it's up to the rest of the GOP to make an argument to that audience without condescending to them to say, look, you've got Trump at the head of the party. He is the grenade thrower. He's the fighter. He's the outsider that this part of the base wanted. But it's not working in other places, and it's not working in many of these Senate seats. And if you lose a lot of those seats, it will be damaging to Trump, who is the person that they support. I'm not sure that that actually works. You may end up with Bannon type wins in primaries that do end up torpedoing other Senate races. It's a real risk.
Yeah, I mean, Stuart, this was a very close race, and you can argue, well, it shouldn't have been close in Alabama, in a red state like Alabama. But had Roy Moore won, even just by a little bit, I'm wondering if people would be saying Steve Bannon, was very prescient for continuing to stick by him, and that this is just the next wave of Bannon candidates.
Listen, Anderson, you and I know, everybody knows that if Roy Moore had won, Steve Bannon would have been up on that stage last night instead of hiding back in the back room. But listen, I just want to say one thing. Those of us who weren't for Roy Moore, who are Republicans, I don't think we really should be patting ourselves on the back too much, because this was a race that was won by African Americans in Alabama. And I think it's just very important and very, frankly, moving to me that when there was a call to decency, not for the first time, black Alabamians saved Alabama from their worst instincts. I mean, they voted in record numbers. They won the day yesterday, and I think that's just a tremendous step in this long civil rights march that Alabama has been at the center of.
I think there's another thing at play here, though, which is, and I don't want to take away from that, I think Democrats did a really good job with GOTV, with black Alabamians specifically, but there's also this part where they've taken, the GOP looks like it's taking college-educated white moms, married women who they normally do well with in these exurban suburbs, and turning them into essentially what might be a swing vote. And if that happens, if that holds in the future, it happened a little bit in Virginia, now it's happened in deep red Alabama, despite, of course, this is a uniquely bad candidate, but that's a pattern that will not help them.
What do they do about that, though?
Well, as I was saying, I think there has to be an appeal to the more Trump-friendly base to say, look, we need candidates who will bring these folks back in, because the GOP cannot win without some of these, particularly married women, is a block that they've done well with in the past, and they're losing them in.
Do you think some of it has to do with the president himself and the accusations against him?
Yes, I think it does. But if you look at places, where Ron Johnson won ahead of Trump, there are instances where guys can run ahead of him and do well in those sectors, but they have to play a different kind of game. Very different from the president.
And they have to have a really good ground game. One of the big winners yesterday really was Mayor Woodfin of Birmingham. If you look at his election, he even though he was Hillary's state chairman, he utilized the Sanders Network, Working Families Party. They had grassroots, and he tied in other coalitions that Bernie Sanders had, and the union vote, and I think because he was just elected, he had this great ground game. And by the way, remember, he beat a fellow Democrat. So he put to work, I think, his maybe liberal ideological team who were already in place, and they knew how to get there.
Stuart, if you're advising President Trump now about who do you listen to moving forward? Do you keep running with Steve Bannon? Do you start, talking to Mitch McConnell more and listening to him, or listening to Ivanka Trump? What do you do?
Well, I think with the surprise of the Trump election, there were those that said that all the political rules that we've lived by are thrown out the window, that characteristics like likability and decency and kindness and graciousness, which are really the hallmarks of the Reagan presidency, of the first Bush presidency, those of us who were drawn to the party because of those qualities, that they're no longer needed, that they're no longer valued at the ballot box. I don't think that's the case. And when you look around at candidates that are doing well, these are very likable, decent people who are about bringing people together and not dividing. say what you will, my friend Ed Gillespie lost in Virginia, but he lost to someone who really was very likable. And I think that Jones is just a very likable, decent guy that you could be for, even if you didn't agree with him on every issue. And I think that's where the political heart of America still beats, and I think to look at Trump and say that this is just all thrown out the window would be a mistake. And Bannon is just an angry guy who is trying to ride and prove that it's okay to be angry. But it's just, I just don't think it's appealing to people.
It is interesting because when Bannon left the White House, there were all those quotes from him about, we're going to war and this is, he's going to be leading the charge on getting Trump-like candidates all across, in races all across the country. I mean, to Stuart's point, Mary Catherine, do you think people just don't really want to live in a permanent state of war or want to tear down all institutions?
No, I think some people do, and I think Bannon is one of them. And some people will be very receptive. I mean, one of the reasons that people were willing to vote for Roy Moore, despite much of the things, many things wrong with him as a candidate, was that he would upset Republicans in Washington, D.C. That was a feature of this candidate. And so I think he will continue to find an audience for people who do want to throw that grenade. But I think, yes, the broader public, and like I said, that new swing vote that we're creating does not respond to that in the same way.
Yeah, we're going to leave you there, Mary Catherine Ham, Jack Kingston, Stuart Stevens, always. Thank you guys very much. We also have breaking news in the Russia investigation. 2 key figures interviewed on Capitol Hill today with the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein said about whether Special Counsel Robert Mueller should be fired. Plus details on Donald Trump Jr.'s interview next. Breaking news tonight and a big day for the Russia investigation on Capitol Hill. There's 2 key figures who appeared before 2 key committees today. The House Judiciary Committee grilled Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein on the special counsel's investigation. Meanwhile, just over an hour ago, Donald Trump Jr. finally finished his interview with Senate Intelligence Committee staffers. It was a long day behind closed doors. Our Jessica Schneider joins us now with the latest. So let's talk about Rod Rosenstein coming to the defense of Bob Mueller today.
Yeah, Anderson, Rosenstein, he was unwavering in his support of the special counsel and his team throughout that hours-long contentious hearing where Republicans repeatedly alleged political bias. But Rosenstein, he pointed out that Robert Mueller had been the FBI director under both Democratic and Republican presidents. And then Rosenstein made it clear that despite Republican criticisms, Mueller would remain.
Have you seen good cause to fire Special Counsel Mueller?
No.
He also faced tough questions over the FBI agent Peter Strzok's text messages.
Yeah, and Rosenstein responded by explaining, in his view, that political affiliations or opinions, they're different from bias. And he said that he and Special Counsel Mueller, they've worked together to ensure that political views are not a factor in any investigation. But that really, it hasn't satisfied Republicans. And they say that Strzok's text with an FBI lawyer calling Trump an idiot and loathsome during the campaign. Republicans say, well, that must have impacted his work on the Russia probe, from which he was removed this summer, and his work on the Hillary Clinton email probe, where she was ultimately clear. And Anderson, now the #2 Republican in the Senate, John Cornyn, he's calling for Special Counsel Mueller to just clean house of people on his team who have been politically active, and there are many, and also those who have made comments critical of the president. Anderson?
Finally, Donald Trump Jr. in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee today. What have you learned about that?
Donald Trump Jr., he was behind closed doors for more than 9 hours, a marathon session. But really, we don't know much, except that top Democrat Mark Warner, he told Manu Raju that he wants Trump Jr. to come back to the panel to answer questions from senators, not just from staff like he did today. Senator Warner also would not say if Trump Jr. invoked attorney-client privilege about conversations he had with his father. That's what he did last week with the House Intel Committee. And of course, that move was heavily criticized. And of course, with all this, Anderson, congressional investigators, they want more details on that meeting that Trump Jr. had with the Russian lawyer at Trump Tower in June 2016. And then, of course, answers about his conflicting statements when it was finally uncovered this past summer. Anderson?
Right. Jessica Schneider. Jessica, thanks for the reporting. Coming up now is Michael Zeldin, who's Robert Mueller's former special assistant in the Department of Justice, and Ken Cuccinelli, former Virginia Attorney General. Michael, did it seem to you that Rosenstein was comfortable with the investigation Mueller's conducting, despite saying there's no good cause to remove him?
Yes, it seemed to me that one of the more important conversations he had was they asked him, was he in communication with Mueller? And he said yes, that they were coordinating and discussing the matter with him. They wouldn't answer the question about whether his mandate had been expanded, but that Rosenstein felt that Mueller was acting within the scope of the overview that he had given to him, and that he was comfortable with it, and that he felt that he was operating with a team that was devoid of the type of bias that the Republican members of Congress were accusing him of. So in some sense, Rosenstein supported Mueller without hesitation and said that he is in regular contact with Mueller and overseeing Mueller, so that there's no sense that this is a renegade, runaway special prosecutor without oversight.
Right. Ken, I mean, do you agree with Rosenstein's assessment that there's no good cause to fire Mueller? And do you believe him when he says if there were, that he would do it?
Well, I certainly don't think it's reached that point. I also think that the Deputy Attorney General had to give the answers, and as firmly as he gave them today. I mean, the minute there's a crack in that door, it gets kicked open. And I don't think you'll hear him back off 1 inch of confidence unless and until, and I'm not predicting that it'll happen, but unless and until he is ready to go down the path of considering removing Mueller for good cause. And I don't think he's anywhere near that. I don't think, other than having to deal with the headaches that have arisen from his perspective, that he is going that direction. And frankly, as much as the president and his team don't appreciate what's going on here, I don't think it would help the president. I think there'd be more problems caused by it than solved, even politically.
Michael, in terms of the text about then candidate Trump for the now fired FBI agent, Rosenstein today said that, in his words, it demonstrates political affiliation and that the issue of bias is something different. Is he right there?
I think that is correct. In the scope of one's work as a prosecutor, you encounter FBI agents and other federal prosecutors all have political affiliation. But if you work without, sort of giving deference to the politics of your position in respect of what you're prosecuting, then there's no matter. I was involved in 2 pretty politically charged investigations. One, the holding of American hostages in Iran, and the second, an independent counsel investigation involving George Herbert Walker Bush and then candidate Clinton. We had Democrats and Republicans on both staff in both of those investigations. It didn't impact our determination of the facts in any way, shape, or form. And I think that Rosenstein is saying that exactly today. People are entitled under the First Amendment to have opinions. If there's no evidence that those opinions are biasing the outcome of their investigation, that's so. And that's the way Rosenstein sees it. And he says he's talking to Mueller about that, and that if he finds there's a need for removal, as he did in the case of the FBI agent. Remember, Mueller removed this guy for appearance problems, that they'll do the same thing with any other person that they feel.
Anderson, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that Michael is technically correct, and I think the Deputy Attorney General's answers today were technically correct. But this dives headlong into the pool of propriety versus the appearance of impropriety, and particularly when the FBI agent in question was also involved in the investigation leading to a very questionable outcome in terms of both process by Comey and the decision Comey made. Instead of the Department of Justice, you have the chief of police, federally speaking, making prosecution decisions in the Hillary Clinton investigation. That crossover makes this particularly problematic. It's just very, very ugly.
So may I add one thing to that, which is, with respect to the Hillary Clinton investigation, what Rosenstein testified to is there's an ongoing Inspector General investigation of that exactly, and that when we get the results of that, we'll know what next steps need to be taken. And second, that this same FBI agent was removed early in the summer. Mueller, remember, was only appointed in May. So when he hears that this guy is on their staff, he removes him immediately so as to avoid the appearance issues that Ken raises. So I think that there's a bit of a red herring here with respect to this agent as it relates to the Mueller investigation itself.
Yeah, but Michael, you got to concede that that was the end of July, and technically, again, I completely agree with you. If Mueller doesn't know something, he can't act on that information, right? So he learns about this agent, he removes him from the team. But this is no ordinary prosecution. I mean, we've got both the House and the Senate bringing people in and asking them about the same issues at the same time. I mean, when you have this kind of appearance problem, and surely you'd agree that it's at least an appearance problem, I'll grant you that what Rosenstein said may also be true. Just because someone expresses these opinions strongly and so forth doesn't mean they alter their work. But surely you would concede that to the American people, people who don't necessarily believe it's a clean process, this adds fuel to that fire. Wouldn't you agree?
No, I don't think that this
Because you won't give an inch.
Michael, and then we got to go.
No, I don't think this agent's early involvement in the Mueller investigation tainted it in any way, shape, or form, actually or as a matter of appearance. With respect to the Hillary Clinton emails, that's a different matter. We'll see what the Inspector General says, and then we'll make a decision about what the next steps are with respect to it.
All right. Michael Zeldin, Ken Cuccinelli, appreciate a good discussion. Thank
Good to
you.
be with you.
When we come back, President Trump's new Twitter target is Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who's called for his resignation. We're going to hear from a Senator, Mazie Hirono, who's calling the president a misogynist, a compulsive liar, and an admitted sexual predator in response. Breaking news tonight, as you heard at the top of the hour, Senator Bernie Sanders now calling for Trump's resignation. Take a look at what he said earlier.
Do I think under those considerations of Al Franken resign, do I think the president should resign? I do. Do I think he will? I don't. But yes, I do think he should resign.
Well, he joins a growing group of senators asking the president to step down. One of the first was Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. In response to her calls for his resignation, President Trump tweeted this: "Lightweight Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a total flunky for Chuck Schumer and someone who would come to my office begging for campaign contributions not so long ago and would do anything for them, is now in the ring fighting against Trump, very disloyal to Bill and crooked used." This morning, Senator Gillibrand was asked on the Today Show whether she interpreted that tweet as a sexual reference, that she would trade sexual favors for campaign cash. Here's what she said.
Well, certainly that's how I and many people read it, and it was certainly just a sexist smear intended to silence me. And I'm not going to be silenced on this issue. I've heard the testimony of many women, numerous accusers. I believe them, and he should resign for that.
Well, Senator Mazie Hirono from Hawaii came to her defense, tweeting this: "Donald Trump is a misogynist, compulsive liar, and admitted sexual predator. Attacks on Kirsten are the latest example that no one is safe from this bully. He must resign." I spoke to Senator Hirono just before air. Here's that conversation. Senator, why call for the president's resignation now? I mean, was it the attack on Senator Gillibrand?
I have been contemplating, and in fact, it was that very day that I was going to call upon him for his resignation, because just the litany of all these women coming forward, and I'm grateful that they did, who accused him, including one who had filed a lawsuit against him. The tweet that he did on Kirsten was really beyond the pale, and at that point I said, look, I'm going to take the opportunity to call on him to resign. But I can't make the president resign. He's got to look to his own morals and his sense of integrity to make that decision. And since he has shown neither trait, I don't think he's going to resign.
The White House has said very clearly, though, and many of the president's supporters have said, look, you know, voters knew about these allegations against the president, and they still elected him. They took those into consideration, and they elected him. That they, in effect, had, you know, their say. Haven't they had their say on the matter, as opposed to someone like Al Franken or John Conyers, whose allegations only came to light while they were in office?
Well, I think that maybe a lot of people held their noses, and there are many ways to explain why people voted for Donald Trump. But as I said, one of the women who has come forward against him is filing a lawsuit. I've done depositions. You can find out a lot of things, whether there's a pattern of this kind of misogynistic behavior on the part of the president. So we'll soon find out about that. But in the meantime, I tell you, the constant efforts on their part to try and derail the Mueller investigation is really problematic. And that's an investigation that should occur. Just in case you were about to ask me, Anderson, whether or not there should be a congressional investigation on the president.
Well, I was actually, because some of your colleagues have said, if not resignation, then at least investigating the allegations against the president. To do that, though, Republicans would have to get on board. At least some Republicans. It doesn't seem like there's any appetite for that on the other side of the aisle.
I'd say so. If there's some process by which, particularly in the House, that there's some way that they can gain jurisdiction over the president, then I say go to it. But as I said, there is an ongoing lawsuit by one of these women, and you can find out a lot about the president's behavior if that lawsuit can proceed.
Just lastly, this moment that we're in, the Me Too movement, women coming forward, yes, being heard, taken seriously, in some cases men coming forward. Do you think we'd be here if Donald Trump hadn't been elected president?
I frankly think that he created an environment where there's a counter to the kind of misogynistic, admitted sexual predator kind of behavior that he's engaged in. And I'm really glad that maybe we're in a cultural change moment, which I didn't think would come within my lifetime, where we begin to think about women as more than objects and toys, playthings, because all of us, since time immemorial, we know that men in power have used their power and influence to harass and even to sexually assault us. So I'm really glad that we're at I hope, a cultural tipping point moment where we're going to hold these people accountable. I'm really glad that women are coming forward and their stories are being listened to.
Well, Senator, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Aloha.
Up next, former Apprentice contestant turned senior White House aide Omarosa Manigault-Newman is stepping down from her job. The question is, was she forced out? According to one report, she was escorted off the White House grounds this evening. The latest on that when we continue. Tonight, there is yet another staff departure from the White House. Former Apprentice contestant Omarosa Manigault-Newman is leaving her job as a senior staffer in the Office of Public Liaison and an assistant to the president. President Trump tweeting this evening, quote, "Thank you, Omarosa, for your service. I wish you continued success." Her tenure had its controversies, certainly, and according to reports, her exit may have gotten a bit confrontational. Here's Tom Foreman.
On the president's former TV show, she was the player people love to hate. Confrontational, controversial, and finally canned.
Omarosa, go out and sell paintings or whatever the hell you're doing. You're fired.
Now it's happened again. Just months after she married and led her 39-person wedding party on a tour of the White House, described as disruptive at best, she's resigning from the administration. At least that's the official story, and CNN has found nothing to disprove it. But various other media outlets say she was flatly fired and escorted off the grounds amid profanities.
He has to defend his wife just as strongly as he will defend this nation.
It's a big come down for a woman who fiercely fought all critics of Donald Trump on his way up, and as president, too.
Joy, I know it's got to be really, really hard after, the last year and a half of all the things that you said about Donald to see him sitting in the Oval Office. Every critic, every detractor will have to bow down to President Trump. It is the ultimate revenge to become the most powerful man in the universe.
Look at my African American over here. Look at him.
Part of Omarosa's role seemed to be answering all those bitter accusations that he was too cozy with racists, too distant from minorities.
I did my best to try to keep this as civil as possible.
But her vigorous defense often tilted into shouting, as it did during this convention for black journalists. She never backed down.
Ask your question, but don't lecture. Here we go. I now work for this country, and I take my job very seriously.
Maybe so, but others did not, especially after Chief of Staff John Kelly took over. That, according to a former administration official who told CNN, people have long been unsure what she did at the White House, what value she brought. Many of her colleagues are elated at news of her departure.
Coming up, President Trump calls Senator-elect Doug Jones to congratulate him on his win in the Alabama race, but Republican Roy Moore is still not conceding. We'll have the latest from the White House, Capitol Hill, and Alabama next. Well, it has been a long, strange trip in Alabama for the president, or more accurately, a Luther Strange trip that turned into much more drama and ended in defeat. Defeat of accused child molester Roy Moore, defeat of Steve Bannon, defeat of the president's multiple endorsements. Now the president is attempting to distance himself and also somehow congratulate himself. Jeff Zeleny joins us now from the White House with the latest. So explain how the president reacted to Moore's loss, or what we know about it.
Anderson, no question the president did not think today would roll out like this. But again, it's a part of a pattern of the president not taking responsibility, but sort of parceling out the blame and quickly moving on. He showed his mood in a series of tweets this morning, fairly early this morning. It started like this. Let's take a look. He said this about the race last night. He said, "The reason I originally endorsed Luther Strange and his numbers went up mightily is that I said Roy Moore would not be able to win the general election. I was right. Roy worked hard, but the deck was stacked against him." So Luther Strange, of course, was the original Republican running against Roy Moore, who the president backed. Originally, he was burned in that race, and again, he was burned in this race. A couple hours later, the president said this about the quality of the candidate in the race, talking about Roy Moore, of course. He said this. He said, if last night's election proved anything, it proved that we need to put up great Republican candidates to increase the razor-thin margins in both the House and Senate. Implied in that is that Roy Moore was not a good candidate. Well, never mind the fact that the president defied all political advice from Republican advisors here at the White House, on Capitol Hill, at the Republican National Committee, and went all in for Roy Moore. He followed Steve Bannon's advice, and that burned him today, Anderson.
Do we know what was said between the president and Doug Jones in the call?
Anderson, we were told that call, which came mid-afternoon or so, right before the president gave his tax speech from the Oval Office. He spoke with Doug Jones. He offered his congratulations, we were told, and he talked about moving forward, working on this agenda, moving forward for the Alabama people. And it's interesting because, of course, Doug Jones will become one of those Democrats, a few Democrats. They've really become somewhat of an extinct creature here in Washington, a Democrat from a red state. He wants to work with him. But beyond that, it was not much more than pleasantries, I'm told. But he did invite him here to the White House, which, Anderson, that's something that used to happen all the time. Republican presidents, Democratic presidents used to have new senators to the White House. We'll see if anything actually comes of this meeting during this deeply partisan environment.
And, Jeff, I'm wondering what you're hearing about Steve Bannon. I mean, how much blame is he getting after this loss?
Anderson, at the end of a long day here of recriminations and finger-pointing, there's no question that Steve Bannon is blamed by so many people, including here at the White House. The open question here is, what does the president think about Steve Bannon's political acumen? Will he keep following him in the 2018 midterm elections? That's what matters now. Steve Bannon, of course, came out so strong after Roy Moore beat Luther Strange just a few months ago in Alabama. Now he's weakened. The question is, will the president still listen to him in those private conversations? Many Republicans here hope he does not. Again, the president seems to turn again and again back to Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon, of course, blamed all of this on Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. That's a pretty difficult square to circle, Anderson.
Yeah. Jeff Delaney, thanks very much tonight. The president's approval ratings dropped to its lowest level since he took office, according to a new Monmouth University poll. It shows just 32% approve of the job President Trump is doing, 56% disapprove. With me now, CNN senior political analyst and former advisor to four presidents, David Gergen, and CNN political analyst and New York Times White House correspondent, Maggie Haberman. Maggie, do you have any sense of, is there a feeling among folks at the White House that they need to course correct in some way?
It depends on what you mean by course correct, meaning end the constant base play that we have seen throughout. That comes from the president, and that is he has had a paralytic fear of losing his base. He believes that he got where he is by having this 35% to 38%, that will be what carries the day throughout. He does recognize, though, that there is at least some limit on that. While he is selling this as, I was in a lose-lose situation, there was not much I can do, he has enough doubt about what he did in endorsing Roy Moore that he has solicited opinions from a number of people throughout the day today, which is always what he does when he's not feeling entirely sure. It's not really clear what that course correction would look like. What we have seen this president do in his year in office has been very consistent. He follows Mitch McConnell until that doesn't work anymore, and then he goes essentially with Steve Bannon or his base. I don't think that he knows of another way. We're going to see what the impact is of this on the tax plan vote. If this has a deleterious effect, which it might, then I think you will see a course correction. If not, I think he will see it as a sign that he's vindicated once again and he keeps going to the next crisis.
David, as someone who's worked in a number of White Houses, should there be a course correction?
Well, it's not clear he's on a course. I mean, he jumps from one thing to the next, so you never know quite where he is. He's sort of one lily pad to the next. But he does need a change of strategy. He needs a strategy. And he cannot, I think the signs are now clear, not only from Doug Jones and Alabama, but from Virginia and New Jersey, that a wave is building up. And unless he changes or adopts a strategy which goes beyond his base, which starts appealing to moderate Republicans and also starts appealing to independents, it's not only the Republican control of the House and the Senate which is threatened, but it's going to be his own reelection. I think it's absolutely clear that he has to change the way change to a new strategy. We waited for a long time to see if Donald Trump himself would change, and we learned he would not. So it's hard to be optimistic it's going to happen, but it's what he needs.
Talking about change, there is that new Iowa poll that I just want to say. I mean, we talked about the Monmouth poll with 32% approval, a new Des Moines Register poll showing him with only a 35% approval rating in Iowa. 60% of Iowans say the country's on the wrong track. I mean, Iowa is a state where he won by 9 points.
Iowa, no, oh yes, in the general election. Sorry, I was thinking the caucuses. Yeah, I mean, look, Iowa was a key Midwestern state for him. I mean, I think the wrong track numbers can be a little bit deceptive because the wrong track numbers were pretty high under Obama too. But clearly, as David said, you can see a wave building in a number of states. The White House also, this has been a big complaint for a while. They don't have a really in-depth political operation. So you have a president who basically guides his own experience through instinct, and he's a very, very reactive politician. Everything is sort of by sight and by sound at these rallies that he was going to daily during the campaign. He's at them maybe once a month at this point, so he has to rely on sort of a seeing eye dog in the form of Steve Bannon or other people. That's problematic. John Kelly is very upfront with people in the White House that he himself is not a political guy, so he is not going to be the person doing that. And Bill Stepien, who is the political director, has a lot of fans in the White House. He also has some detractors in and outside. You know, people will say he comes under fire because he's not a Karl Rove or a David Axelrod, and that is true. He's basically a field guy. He's a certain kind of operative. There isn't a depth of a bench at either the RNC to bolster them now, other than, again, in data and in money. But in terms of what they are doing instinctively and for strategic terms, there's just not much of an operation there.
David, because I mean, in most White Houses, and you can speak to this better than anybody, there would be a bigger, a more complex or experienced operation. It seems like with the president, a lot of the political operation is the idea of just him going out and doing rallies just like he did in the campaign trail.
Absolutely. If you think about the most successful chiefs of staff, usually that person is someone who has a lot of political moxie. You think of James Baker, who ran 2 campaigns against Reagan, and the day after Reagan was elected, he asked Jim Baker to come in and be his chief of staff. And yes, he had a political office at Ed Rowlands and Lynn Nofziger and others, but it was really important that he had Baker there, where everything is integrated, and your politics and your policy and what you've got to do on the Hill and all those sorts of things are integrated, and that is in the chief of staff's office. Same thing was true of John Podesta, who was a very good chief of staff for Bill Clinton, went on and ran Hillary's campaign as the chairman. That, again, is somebody that you ideally want around the president. I think Maggie makes a very good point. He does not have anybody of real stature that he trusts. Around him to help him with his politics.
You also, when you start to look at the calendar, I mean, you know, midterm elections are you know, coming up, and then it's the presidential election. I mean, it starts to get into a certain worn path.
Yeah, one thing that Jonathan Martin, my colleague, and I had reported on this a couple of weeks ago, that there was a real lack of planning about the midterms that was going on. As it happened, there had been an Oval Office meeting that day involving Kelly, Mike Pence, Stepien, the president, and Rick Dearborn, a deputy chief of staff. But they were just beginning this at that point. And when I was speaking to White House aides, they would say, look, we've actually devoted a lot of our political resources to the policy programmatic aspects, to trying to work the Hill. You have to be able to work both tracks in this in any White House, but especially in this climate. And they are going into a year where all of the forces appear to be against them, with the exception of the economy. But still, the midterms tend to be when the party that is in power gets beaten up, and he's facing.
And you also have not just, you know, on the Democratic side, you have Steve Bannon. And the question is he going to be running, you know, warfare against mainstream Republicans? I mean, Mitt Romney's the perfect example.
Absolutely. Yeah, at some point, the White House have to decide: are we going to ban this guy from the White House, or what are we doing here? Because he can't have it both ways. Be talking to the president, running against the establishment, ruining the possibilities of the Republicans holding the House and Senate. That's a really a big deal. But let me just go to the point of the substance too. I think the president will get his tax. I sense he has the momentum. He can get the tax bill through. There may be something that derails it, but we haven't seen it yet. But I think next year is going to be much harder for him substantively. Typically, a president has 1 year to get things done before you got to start worrying about the midterm elections. And now, how does he get infrastructure done, entitlement reform, and some of these other big issues? I don't see how he gets that done.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that he's coming into this with tremendously strong headwinds. It is hard to see.
And what about Bannon?
Well, I mean, what I started to say actually when you were talking about how somebody has to say, you know, this guy can't come to, it has to be the president who says, I'm not going to talk to this guy. Donald Trump, in the same way that he has never severed ties with Roger Stone, despite what everybody always says, there's this constant, you know, he will say Roger Stone doesn't speak for me. He is always watching Roger Stone out of the corner of his eye. He is always still talking to Roger Stone. However sporadically that might be, however frequently it might be, they still talk, they still communicate. The same is true with Bannon. He knows with both of them that they can speak to his base and they can understand his base the same way that he can, and in some ways better than he can, because so much of what he does is reactive. It is dependent on what he sees in front of him. What he's seeing right now is largely on television. He's not seeing it in person, and that matters.
Fascinating. Maggie Haberman, thanks. You're going to be around for our panel. David Gergen, thanks so much. Got to take a quick break. Our panel is next, and later the USA Today editorial board not mincing words, saying a president who would all but call Senator Kirsten Gillibrand a whore is not fit to shine George W. Bush's shoes or clean the toilets in the Barack Obama Presidential Library. That is the editorial board of the USA Today. We're going to hear from a member of that board ahead. Welcome back. For the first time in 25 years, Alabama has elected a Democrat to the U.S. Senate. You probably know that by now. Today, Doug Jones says he is aware that some people might have voted not so much for him, but against his opponent.
There is also that segment of this population who voted against Roy Moore. I understand that. I get that. But you know what? That's not a bad thing. With that kind of politics for a segment of the population in Alabama to help reject that kind of history and that divisive rhetoric, I think that that's a good thing.
And Maggie Haberman from The Times is back. Joining us as well is Paul Begala, Jack Kingston, Tara Setmayer, Scott Jennings, and Josh Green. Maggie, I mean, you weren't there last night with us. What do you see in the victory of Doug Jones? How do you interpret it?
I mean, I think that somebody made this point to me on Twitter, and I think it was a fair one. I was talking about turnout among black voters being pretty pivotal, but it was a 1.5-point race. There were a lot of pivotal factors. I think at the end of the day,
the write-in as candidates.
Write-in was a factor. A lot of people staying home was a factor. Votes in key counties for Jones being above where they needed to in terms of turnout, votes for Moore in key counties being below where they needed to. Look, it is a pretty remarkable occurrence. This is a unicorn vote. This is a Democrat in Alabama for a Senate seat. I don't know how much more we can interpret based on the specific results, but there's a couple of key points we can look toward as indicators, which is the president's approval was pretty low in exits. We know that Roy Moore was a uniquely complicated and compromised candidate. Doug Jones is a pro-choice Democrat who got elected in this state. So many voters didn't know that because this entire race was about Roy Moore, and that was it. Not a lot of this race could be duplicated somewhere else, but we do see consistently in state by state, in special elections over the last year, and then in non-special elections, there is some kind of movement building against the president that is a bad harbinger for next year. And I think that if you are the White House, that has to be what you are looking at. And if you are Mitch McConnell and if you are Paul Ryan, you are getting very nervous about holding your majorities.
Scott, do you see this as a movement against the president or some sort of a wave building?
Well, certainly there's a movement among Democrats who are very angry about having lost the presidential election to get it together and turn out and vote. And that's clearly what happened. And I think President Obama's last-minute intervention with African-American voters clearly had an effect on turnout, which helped in Alabama. I think Maggie's right. There's a lot of circumstances here that aren't going to be replicated elsewhere. But there's one thing we can know for sure. Candidate quality matters. Roy Moore, he'll be remembered as the guy who lost because he was an alleged pedophile. This candidacy was in serious trouble before that, and he was already on the decline. He was being seriously outspent. And right now, in the Republican Party, there are people who are trying to recruit similar types of candidates in Senate races around the country. This is a recipe for disaster. So if there's a silver lining...
Non-child abusing.
Sure, but candidates who don't appeal to a broad electorate. Right. So if there's a silver lining, it's this. This shines a bright light on you cannot follow these kinds of candidacies down a path that destroys your party.
Well, Josh, you wrote the book on Bannon. I mean, what happens to Bannon now? What does Bannon argue? I mean, I know he's blaming Mitch McConnell, basically.
Well, it's a huge embarrassment for Bannon. I mean, he went out and jumped in foursquare behind Roy Moore. And in a sense, Steve Bannon is the guy who nationalized this election because he came in and he said, look, this is going to be a proxy battle in this war between the hard right nationalists that I represent and the GOP establishment that Mitch McConnell represents. And you know, floor got wiped with his candidate last night. McConnell was the clear victor in that showdown. And I think it does a lot to kind of puncture this aura that Bannon has worked very hard to build up, that he has some kind of psychic connection with Trump voters, with the Republican base, that he can transfer to other candidates in other Republican primaries and potentially knock off GOP incumbents in eventually McConnell himself.
Someone last night in one of the panels, I can't remember who it was, maybe someone here, said that when you get in early into politics and you have to, work on a campaign where the person wins, you start to think that you're the candidate that kind of that you have tapped into something, and you feel that way until you then get slapped down the next time and lose.
Well, I think that's part of it. I do think that, Carville and I got pretty famous off of Bill Clinton. We never spoke at rallies, right? We stayed back behind the scenes and behind the stage. And Bannon, not only did he come out, he came out against the president. That is unprecedented. I never saw my friend Karl Rove do that to George W. Bush. Axe never did that to President Obama. Carville and I never did that to Clinton. This is without precedent that he's taking on the president, even insulted the president's daughter at a rally. It's extraordinary, and it's noteworthy. Maggie understands why. Anyway.
And the president didn't respond to that. That was one of the few times.
I mean, this is the thing. I mean, this idea that this is. It's not like people keep saying, why is Bannon being allowed to do this? Because the president's not saying don't, because the president's still taking his phone calls. They spoke yesterday.
But Bannon also has a little bit of a kind of street cred, almost a folk hero lore in his own right. And so I think he's a different kind of consultant in that respect. But where I wonder, where was he when the story broke in the Washington Post? Why didn't he say to Judge Moore, now you're going to be on national TV, the spotlights are going to be incredible, here's what you're going to say, and you're not going to say anything else? Because I think Moore, and as much as anything, confirmed these women just by the way he reacted.
Well, no, but Moore, I think that night it broke, if it wasn't the night, it was the next night, he was at the Citadel, I think it was, and we carried him live, and he was saying, you're going to see things coming out about these women, that there's collusion, and they were, he went after the women.
I was actually traveling with him on that trip. Right. And he was on the phone with Roy Moore, with Sean Hannity, trying to arrange a friendly audience for Moore to explain himself. That interview wound up going disastrously for Moore because he essentially bragged about dating teenagers as a 30-year-old man. Didn't do a lot to help himself.
Right.
Yeah. But there's something else going on here with Steve Bannon that I think doesn't get enough attention. I was at a lot of the rallies down in Alabama, and when Bannon would come out to speak, he wasn't really speaking about Roy Moore. He was trying to push his ideas about nationalism, about populism, his feud with Bannon, and cultivate this image of himself as a folk hero. So this wasn't, he does it ostensibly in Trump's name, but what he's really doing is trying to kind of build up his own aura.
Can I ask you a question? Do you think that that's because he's looking at the long game into the midterms, assuming that Roy Moore was going to win, that he would be able to point to that and use whatever lore he thought he was creating so that he could go in with these other candidates and primary Republicans?
I think that's exactly what he was thinking he was going to do, and it failed disastrously.
It was a disaster. Something else I think that's interesting about this, and to Scott's point, candidate recruitment does matter. And Republicans learned this the hard way in 2010, where we had the opportunity to pick up Senate seats in places like Nevada, in places like Delaware, where we had horrible Tea Party candidates, they were considered back then, but in Sharon Angle and in Christine O'Donnell in Delaware, where she actually had to address an accusation about being a witch. Some of us will remember that.
Point out she denied.
Right. She said, I am not a witch, yes. Which, that's as bad as, no, I don't beat my wife. I mean, it was a disaster, and it was an opportunity where we could have, those two Senate seats are still Democrat, and it's a shame. And are we going to repeat that cycle again? And it looks as though we should have learned that lesson. But with Bannon, if he's allowed to have that kind of influence with candidates again, that's going to be a disaster for Republicans.
Have you ever asked Bannon, or has he ever talked about himself running for something?
No, he denies he has any interest in doing that, but as a couple of people have pointed out, I think, he has spent the time since he's left the White House barnstorming the country, giving public speeches, and essentially trying to build a following for what he says is Trumpism, but is really Bannonism. Trump showed that the set of ideas he got elected in are not the ones that he's going to push as president of the United States. He's gone more in Mitch McConnell's direction. Bannon has not let go of those ideas, and I think believes that he can push them, and by defeating candidates like the ones that Mitch McConnell endorses, ultimately win this battle within the party.
But remember this, in a 1.5% race on the incredibly flawed candidate, he still did fairly well. When you think about Roy Moore would be any's candidate's opposition dream. The wacky things he said, not only was he quoted as saying it, but there was videotape of him saying it. And as everybody knows, you really want to kill a candidate in his own words, just rolling his own words back to him. And so, you know, you had that, then you had the sexual misconduct. And remember, the last statewide election that Roy Moore ran in, he only won by 52%. He had already been impeached.
One thing, though, to Josh's point about bootstrapping a lot of other issues that Bannon brought into this race, what this race ultimately came down to was a litmus test involving the believability of a lot of women who had accused him of sexual misconduct, including child molestation. That is a problem for a president who has been facing his own accusations of sexual misconduct. And that is where I'm not sure this was a wise bet. Forget about the president's own bet on this, which he did for all kinds of reasons, but he was encouraged by Bannon and by a few other people who believed that this election, if Roy Moore won, it would make it a lot harder for that momentum to kind of sweep up the president, and that's not how that worked out.
We got to take a quick break. When we come back, the scathing message from the USA Today editorial board. They say the president is not fit for office after his tweet about Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, and believe his words are full of sexual innuendo. We'll speak to one of the USA Today editors next.
And fathers.
The president's new Twitter target is Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who uncoincidentally started calling for President Trump's resignation over the weekend. Here's the tweet from the leader of the free world. Lightweight Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a total flunky for Chuck Schumer and someone who would come to my office begging for campaign contributions not so long ago and would do anything for them, is now in the ring fighting against Trump, very disloyal to Bill and crooked, used. This morning, Senator Gillibrand was asked on the Today Show whether she interpreted the tweet as a sexual reference, that she would trade sexual favors for campaign cash. Here's what she said.
Well, certainly that's how I and many people read it, and it was certainly just a sexist smear intended to silence me. And I'm not going to be silenced on this issue. I've heard the testimony of many women, numerous accusers. I believe them, and he should resign for that.
In response, the USA Today editorial board, which is not known for blistering opinion pieces, wrote an editorial that includes this line: a president who would all but call Senator Kirsten Gillibrand a whore is not fit to clean the toilets in the Barack Obama Presidential Library or to shine the shoes of George W. Bush. Joining me to discuss is Dave Mastio, the deputy editorial page editor at USA Today. David, the language in this editorial is really searing. I'm wondering why the editorial board felt it important or necessary to write this.
I think the main issue was responding to the provocation from Donald Trump. I think we listened to the coverage of what he had said in that tweet all day long, and what we heard was euphemism after euphemism, not calling out the president on exactly what he really said. And we thought that using plain English, making it clear and calling out the president would do a service.
Obviously, Sarah Sanders was asked about President Trump's tweet in yesterday's press briefing, and I just want to play some of that.
Is Gillibrand owed an apology for the misunderstanding of the president's tweet this morning? Because many, including the senator, thinks that it's about sexual innuendos.
I think only if your mind is in the gutter would you have read it that way, and so no.
It's also an argument that they used when I think during the Megyn Kelly comments made by the president. You clearly don't buy that it just it has nothing to do with sex.
I think it's completely preposterous when you can use the same language to a man and the same language to a woman, and it means completely different things. Everyone knows what Trump meant when he said that Megyn Kelly was bleeding from her wherever, and everyone knew what the president meant when he said that Kirsten Gillibrand was willing to do anything.
The editorial went on to say, quote, with his latest tweet clearly implying that a United States senator would trade sexual favors for campaign cash, President Trump has shown he is not fit for office. Rock bottom is no impediment for a president who can always find room for a new low. Do you think this is a bottom for him?
I keep trying to give the president the benefit of the doubt. I would really like to have a successful presidency. I'm an American just like anybody else. And over again, I thought he's going to start learning. We've thought that he was going to change and turn things around, but it never happens. So I wouldn't put any faith in that.
You know, this is not the first editorial that's been very tough on Donald Trump from the USA Today. About a month before the election, there was one titled "Trump is unfit for the presidency," which was really noteworthy at the time because it was the first time in the paper's 34-year history that has taken sides in a presidential election to supporters of the president who say, look, this is, another hatchet job by liberal media. What do you say?
I say that's absolutely not true. We're an editorial board that goes from very conservative members like me to very liberal members. We have a lot of moderates, and we're trying to come from a practical centrist perspective from where the American people are coming from. I grew up in Ohio and Michigan and Nebraska. We're not, an East Coast elitist editorial board. We're like every other American, and we're trying to help make the country a better place. And when we were writing this editorial, we thought just being straight with what exactly the truth was and what was going on would help us get there.
David, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up next, an emotional moment. Former Vice President Joe Biden comforting Meghan McCain, her father, Senator John McCain, of course, fighting the same brain cancer that Biden's son died of 2 years ago. We'll show you the moment ahead. A touching moment this morning on ABC's The View. Co-host Meghan McCain, the daughter of Republican Senator John McCain, got choked up as she talked to former Vice President Joe Biden, a Democrat, about her dad's brain cancer. Biden's son, Beau, of course, died of the same cancer 2 years ago. Joe Biden and John McCain have been friends for decades. They served in the Senate together. This morning, Biden offered some words of encouragement to McCain's daughter. It is long, but it's really worth watching. Take a look.
I couldn't get through your book. I tried. Your son, Beau, had the same cancer that my father was diagnosed with 6 months ago. And I'm sorry.
But there's a lot of hope, babe.
I think about Beau almost every day. And I was told, I'm sorry, that this doesn't get easier, but that you cultivate the tools to work with this and live with this. I know you and your family have been through tragedy that I couldn't conceive of.
Well, look,
what would you tell people? It's not about me. It's about everyone with cancer.
No, it is about everyone. But look, one of the things that gave Beau courage, my word, was John. Your dad, you may remember when you were a little kid, your dad took care of my Beau. Your dad, when he was a mill aide, worked with me, became friends with Beau. And Beau talked about your dad's courage, not about illness, but about his courage. And look, there's a lot of things happening. Any of you have somebody who is diagnosed with glioblastoma, which is about as bad as it gets. There's breakthroughs that are occurring now. There's 4 things that are going on, and it can happen tomorrow. Like, for example, at the University of Pennsylvania, where I teach now, there is at the Abramson Center. What they found out is a thing called a CAR T cell. What they do is they take the cells, your T cells, their immune system cells, out of your body, and they reinforce it with an antigen, and that goes in and that finds the cancer cell, because the cancer cells can hide from your immune system. And they had a breakthrough with a new drug dealing with child leukemia, and it's working. There's other things called, they have what they did with Beau is starting to happen now. They're using this CAR T cell, and they're using they inject a virus, and it generates into the cancer.
So there's hope.
And so there is hope. And if anybody can make it, your dad, her dad is one of my best friends. Her dad goes after me, hammer and tong. We're like 2 brothers who were somehow raised by different fathers or something because of our points of view. But I know, and I mean this sincerely, and I've said it all, even when your dad got mad at me, so I should get the hell off the ticket. And remember what I said about your dad? I said, I know, and I mean this sincerely, I know if I picked up the phone tonight and called John McCain and said, John, I'm at 2nd and Vine in Oshkosh, and I need your help, come. He'd get on a plane and come. And I would for him, too. And this is the guy.
Senator McCain's office says he is currently hospitalized in Washington, getting treatment for normal side effects of his cancer treatment. He looks forward to returning to work as soon as possible. Back now with the panel. We're also joined again by David Gergen. It is one of those just reminders of decency and humanity in the midst of this, you know, the often horror show of politics in America today. They're just decent people who, you know, are on different sides of the aisle, but who genuinely like each other.
It absolutely is, Anderson, and there are echoes of, in this conversation of what Doug Jones was saying last night in Alabama. That campaign transcended issues. It was much more about decency and a return to civility, and that there's a hunger for that across the country now. I was just in Indianapolis today, and I can tell you that's what they're talking about. That's what they care about, no matter what side of the aisle they're on. I think Joe Biden is a particularly good messenger for the Democratic Party in that regard because he's so human. You know, he's loquacious. He overtalks. He makes mistakes, but he's funny, and he's a very warm human being. And I think he's one of the few. Paul can speak to this, but he's a bridge within the Democratic Party that very few people are. He's a bridge between the moderate, and the more traditional Democrats and the Elizabeth Warren Democrats. I think he does that well.
And by the way, people should read his book. I did.
Yeah.
It's called Promise Me, Dad. It's not a political book. He winds in some policies, really interesting stories about Ukraine, but mostly it's about how a father says goodbye to his son. And this son was, I knew him a bit, was a remarkable guy in his own right. And he walks you through that. And I'm on the board of visitors of MD Anderson, where Bo was treated, and they are finding miracles. The way that he bolstered Meghan McCain in that clip that's Joe Biden this exact same way when the cameras are off. And he does that to strangers all the time because he's been so touched by tragedy and now by cancer. The cancer community and many others, certainly military families, are drawn to him. And I've seen that in him over and over. So I think the book is a terrific book. If I can plug that for a holiday gift, Promise Me, Dad. Anybody who's had to deal with loss, and we all have. Anybody's had to deal with cancer, and I've spent too much time in cancer wards. It's really a powerful testament. It is pure Joe Biden.
What this showed about Joe Biden was something that I think a lot of Democrats missed with Hillary, was his relatability. He was very relatable. That's why they called him Uncle Joe. Even in his gaffes, we all know as Republicans, we would make fun of Joe Biden as a gaffe machine and we'd get a little chuckle out of it. But it made him human, and people love that about him. I have my own experience with the Biden family, and they are amazingly wonderful, good and decent people. I may disagree with them on policy and some politics, but I cannot emphasize what good people they actually are. And it would have been very interesting if he had gotten into that race. I think that I went back and I looked at what his favorables were in 2015, and he was the only Democrat that was not underwater. Hillary Clinton's favorable versus unfavorable, she was underwater. So was Bernie Sanders. But Joe Biden had the highest favorability, and I think that there's probably someone in the Democratic Party that wish he had been the nominee. And to be honest, if it had been Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, I would have had no problem casting a vote for Joe Biden just out of the fact that he's a decent person.
I just got to take a quick break. We only have we're going to talk about Joe Biden. Joe Biden was asked if he would run against President Trump in 2020. His answer, the panel's take on that next. More on Vice President Joe Biden's visit to The View. He was asked if he'd run against President Trump in 2020. Here's his answer.
I have no intention now. I've done nothing at all to put together any kind of operation to run. And as I said, as most of you guys know, no one ever doubts I mean what I say. The problem is I sometimes say all that I mean. And if I were offered the nomination by the Lord Almighty right now today, I would say no, because we're not ready. The family's not ready to do this. If in a year from now, if we're ready and no one has moved in that I think can do it, then I may very well do it. But I'm being as honest as I can.
I'm back now with the panel. Paul, what do you think a Joe Biden run would look like against President Trump?
I think he's beloved in the Democratic Party. I think David's right that there are all these factions, and it's been, so far they've united wonderfully in these elections, but they will present their fissures in 2020. And he does seem to be a unifying force, and in a way that President Obama was. And I think he'd make a hell of a candidate. And particularly, he is middle-class Joe. If you read the book, his political advisor, Mike Donilon, wrote a 20-page memo for him about how you could run back in the last election cycle. And the heart of it, I'm told, I haven't read it, the memo, but the heart of the memo was, you're middle-class Joe. You're from the middle class. You'll fight for the middle class. You'll bring those values of the middle class. You do that, and all of a sudden, perhaps you don't lose Pennsylvania, where Joe Biden grew up, or Michigan, or Wisconsin, or the White House. I think a lot of Democrats are going to be drawn to Joe Biden.
Are you now all showing photos?
Yeah, we are. We all have pictures of Joe. He ran into my son at the University of Texas, and so, of course, I had to take a picture with him and his girlfriend.
He was in Savannah, met my son Jim, good staunch Republican, and you would have thought they were best friends. He quit talking to me. But, you know, I want to say another thing about his character that I think is important. He was one of the few Democrat senators to go to Strom Thurmond's funeral. And at the time, there was a big political cost to it. But he went and he stood proudly. And just like he's doing with McCain, it shows decency. And I got to tell you, you know, I'm like anybody in office. You have your good days and your bad days. I was having a really tough time on something. And where did I get a phone call? But from Max Cleland. Out of the blue, good Democrat. Very liberal. We were always on the opposite side of things. He gave me one of the best pep talks I've ever had, and you do need more of that in Washington, and you do need more of that in politics today. And you know, a guy like Joe Biden doing what he's doing on national TV with. I just think it's very important.
He's hopeful, which, I mean, I think that you don't, I mean, you saw that, I mean, he was using the word, but you saw that when he was talking about McCain, and he and McCain share in common the fact that both of them have gone through experiences in their life that are far beyond what anyone should have to endure, and they are both true public servants. And so, I mean, I think when you think of what the criticisms are of the current president, it's never in public service, and there is this element of sort of self-enrichment that he keeps getting criticized for. That's not what Joe Biden does. I think that all the things, you know, Joe Biden has obviously run for president before and struggled before. The main issue for Biden, and he talked about it, is always that he was seen as a gaffe maker. I think politics moves so fast now, and Trump has set the bar so far in a certain direction, that I think that he would be able to kind of survive, because the news cycle burns so fast and hot and then out.
There's certainly, I mean, age is obviously also something that he would have to consider and voters would consider.
Trump is 71.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
It is, and if you look at, for instance, the coalition of Democrats that have been turning out in elections this year, young people, minorities, suburban women, it's not necessarily clear he could appeal to them better than maybe some of the other Democrats could, but where he really could appear, I think, is to Trump voters. I was in Youngstown, Ohio, at a Biden rally during the campaign, speaking to people in the crowd, and they said, you know, one of the union guys said to me, you know, they send him here because they can't send Hillary here. It's okay because we like him, but I think it just spoke to the fact that he can reach into that kind of blue-collar, white Rust Belt vote that Democrats have had such a hard time maintaining, and maybe pull back some of those voters from Trump.
Yeah, he's I think he would have been a wonderful president. I wish he'd run and won in the past. I do think, and I think he's in excellent shape. He keeps himself in great shape. He's a very youthful, you know, man at this age. But it's also true within the Democratic Party. There is a desire for new faces, moving ahead. And in country after country around the world right now, people are turning to a younger generation. And I think you have to take them, Trudeau in Canada, you look at Argentina, you can go to a country.
I've heard some people say that, you know, if he had a young vice president, he would only promise to serve one term. I mean, I don't know if, you know, that's realistic or not.
That's a possibility. But still, I think that it's going to be hard, you know, and I think he's going to be a great counselor to whoever, and he ought to be right there at the side of whoever gets the nomination. But I think he's realistic enough to know that age is an issue, and there is this, you know, and you can see it in the House with the House Democrats.
Plus once you declare your candidacy, all your flaws come to light. Everybody points out to you what's wrong with you, and so I think that's one of the things that's given him the bounce right now.
The notion of decency, and if somebody sort of carried that as a mantle, I don't know if it can sustain the rough and tumble of a campaign.
Well, I think that given that he's been in politics since he was, 27 years old, I mean, it's been in his entire life, I think that he knows how to handle that. He's been through three presidential elections, 2 as vice president. He's been raked over the coals for other things, with controversies with the plagiarism and different things. And to Maggie's point, which I was going to make before, is that is small potatoes compared to things that we've seen and compared to the flaws of our current president. So I think Biden, well, yeah, he'd have a shot.
All right, thanks everybody. We're going to take a quick break. More news ahead.
CNN.
It's a great night. I hope you join Kelly and I. Or Kelly and me, I should say. Sorry. That does it for us tonight. Very grammatically correct. Thanks for watching. Time to hand it over to Don Lemon. CNN Tonight starts right now.
This is CNN Tonight. I'm Don Lemon. 48 hours ago, I told you there was going to be a day of reckoning in Alabama. Well, there sure was. And this is not the way the president thought his day would go. It was supposed to be a big Republican victory in Alabama's Senate race, a victory made possible when the president threw his support to Roy Moore, who, it bears repeating, is an accused child molester. You know how that worked. A big victory for Democrat Doug Jones, and a humiliating defeat for Moore, for the president, and for the brutal and cynical worldview of Steve Bannon, a man described this way by Republican Congressman Peter King.
This guy does not belong on the national stage. He looks like some disheveled drunk that wandered onto the political stage.
A lot of lessons there for anybody who thought President Trump had rewritten the rules of American politics. His election may have been more about the man than the movement, a movement that may turn out to be not so much grassroots as AstroTurf, smoke and mirrors. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Turns out voters, even in a Republican stronghold like Alabama, are not in lockstep with this president. His approval rating, just 48% there, in a state that he carried by almost 28 points just a year ago. Turns out that the man who, as a candidate famously said, this.
I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters.
Well, that man can't stand on the border of Florida and Alabama and swing an election. The laws of the political universe still apply, and betting on voters who swept Donald Trump into office was a bad bet for Roy Moore. But there's more to all of this. The group of voters who may be the key to Doug Jones' victory in Alabama, African American women. A stunning 98% of black women who voted in this election cast their ballots for Jones. President Barack Obama only got 95% in 2012. The gender gap overall worked in favor of Jones, women voting for the Democrat with a margin of 57 to 41%. Young voters also favored Jones. Voters aged 18 to 44 went for Jones 61 to 38%. But what does this all mean for the president and his agenda? Well, if Alabama is any indication, President Trump and his party may be on a long, rocky road. Let's discuss now. CNN political commentator David Swerdlick is here. Political analyst April Ryan is here as well, and Bob Cusack, editor-in-chief of The Hill. Thank you all for joining us. Good evening. Post-election eve, right? Bob, President Trump trying to turn the page after suffering a humiliating loss. He is 0 for 2 in Alabama. Here's the president today.
A lot of Republicans feel differently. They're very happy with the way it turned out. But I would have, as the leader of the party, I would have liked to have had the seat. I want to endorse the people that are running.
So President Trump went all in for Roy Moore. Is the president weaker today than he was yesterday, Bob?
I think he is, Don. I mean, he backed Strange in the primary, lost it. This is a state he won big time. And then, of course, Doug Jones won. I mean, this is one of the most stunning elections that we're going to see in our lifetime. The situations where some Republicans were actually rooting for a Democrat, I think like Mitch McConnell, we're never going to see again. So I think this hurts his agenda in one big way. Obamacare replacement legislation. They almost got it through the Senate. They didn't. And Doug Jones is going to be around next year. I think Obamacare, the law, I mean, it's been very resilient. It's been criticized repeatedly. It's been legally challenged. It's been legislatively challenged. I think Obamacare is going to be around for a while.
Even with the mandate in the tax, with them
well,
wanting to get rid of the
administratively and the tax bill, they can chip away at it, but actually replacing it on a big level that they wanted to do earlier this summer, no chance.
Just completely getting rid of it. Okay, April, let's move on. Roy Moore, I mean, he really had a laundry list of problems. Let's be honest here. He was a flawed candidate. But this loss was in Alabama where, you should be able to run anyone with an R in front of their name. The president is trying to minimize the defeat. But what does this say about his political strength, you think?
The president's political strength was, I guess you would say, it leaned on Steve Bannon. And Steve Bannon was somewhat of a crutch here. And I guess that crutch is broken because the president is weakened. This was not a good moment for the president. Alabama, the reddest of red states, I mean, blood red, bright red. And they could not win the state. And the president, supported someone else, yes, but he ultimately fell in line with Steve Bannon, who thought he was a kingmaker. And, it's really interesting, and I thought about what you just said at the beginning. You were talking about numbers. And I just think about and how women voted for the other candidate, for Doug Jones. And I think about how the president had 51% of white women in his corner, particularly those who married white women. 51% of married white women were in his corner, voted for the president. And look at how women voted overwhelmingly for the Democrat. And I'm thinking about those women who voted for the president. They voted for their husband's interests, according to Gloria Steinem. And now, with what happened in Alabama, that still has high numbers in popularity for the president, they totally turned tide and went in the opposite direction. This is a moment that it's going to be a marker for this president, a huge marker.
I want to ask you, David, because in the beginning I said pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, and you get what that was, right? That was a reference to the Wizard of Oz,
Steve
where
Bannon,
and Steve Bannon, where when they finally go behind the curtain and they see it's not a god back there, it's just this one guy with a megaphone or a microphone, a green screen, and some levers. And so people have been putting too much stock, too much faith, saying that Steve Bannon is this Svengali when maybe he isn't really.
So, Don, I don't think Bannon is going anywhere. He will regroup and try to make his mark in 2018 in an assortment of races around the country. But yes, last night in Alabama, he was repudiated, and his approach of trying to upend the Republican Party and the whole political system really suffered a setback because by not going with the establishment candidate, Luther Strange, Republicans coughed up a seat to Democrats in the reddest of red states. Politics is a game ultimately of addition, not subtraction. It's a cliche, but it's true. If you have both houses of Congress and the White House, as Republicans do, and you're trying to march forward with an agenda piece by piece, regardless of what people think of that agenda, what you want to do is build seats, not turn over the wheelbarrow and try and destroy the establishment. You're trying to march forward to a goal. And Bannon, with this weird brew of, it's not conservatism, it's this hodgepodge of statism and protectionism and anti-immigration
nationalism,
nationalism and anti-establishmentarianism, even though he went to Harvard and he worked for Goldman Sachs. And whatever he's trying to sell, it's not as easy as he probably has thought it was coming out of the victory of President Trump a year ago.
Hey, Bob, I want to ask you this. I thought it was very interesting that Ari Fleischer tweeted this. You remember he was this White House spokesperson under President Bush. He said, establishment candidate Ed Gillespie lost. Non-establishment candidate Roy Moore lost. The lesson? A base-only POTUS isn't enough for the GOP to win. D's hate Trump more than R's love him. POTUS needs to increase his approval rating, or D turnout will kill R's in 2018. I mean, Bob, how many times have people on this program and other programs and political commentators and strategists, how many times have they said the exact same thing? But yet this administration and this president doesn't seem to listen. He keeps going back to the base because he needs those cheerleaders. He needs that ego boost.
Well, I mean, we do have to think also that they haven't gotten much done legislatively. They don't have a big bill win. They didn't get health care done. They haven't got transportation done. I think they're going to get this tax cut bill done. But at the same time, is that going to really get him to 50%? No. I think the White House has to think, let's get to 50%. And on Bannon, I think, how is he going to raise money after this massive loss? I think a lot of Republican incumbents who are up for re-election, who were nervous about Bannon a couple days ago, they're not so nervous anymore because Bannon's going to have a fundraising issue.
Do you want, Bob, do you want the president campaigning with you in 2018?
I think you want him in primaries. I'm not so sure in the general. I mean, Barbara Comstock, who lives out by me in Virginia, I mean, I don't think she's going to have Trump in her district because Trump is unpopular. I think it depends on the situation. But in primaries that are upcoming in the early part of the year, you probably want Trump. General election, not so much.
April, what do you think? Do you think that Republican candidates in 2018, you think they're going to be energized? Will that energize the Democrats if the president is campaigning with them?
Of course, it'll energize Democrats, but I'm thinking of Republicans. 2018 is right here. And you have to think about this. It all depends on the time and what's going on. If things continue to steadily go in a downward path, I don't believe you're going to get many people wanting the president. But of course, you're going to have those areas that are solid Trump areas that there may be a call for him. But I don't believe if this president continues to go down this path, and if he does not have the legislative win, a legislative win that he's hoping for, people may take a second thought and really rethink bringing him on the campaign trail.
Let's talk about his approval rating, David. Job approval rating, 32%, and that's according to a Monmouth University poll. That's the same as a Pew poll last week. And by the way, President George W. Bush didn't hit numbers like this until well into his presidency during the Iraq War. How do numbers like that impact the president's deal-making abilities? I mean, to April's point just a second ago.
Exactly, 32%. The highest number you see out there is the Gallup Daily at 36, but that's the most, right? So what you have with Alabama last night, with the repudiation by the Alabama voters, even though it was fairly narrow, even though Roy Moore was a terrible candidate, and with these approval numbers that are stuck in the mid to low 30s, you have Republican candidates next year, like Bob and April said, and also Republicans already on the Hill who can make their own decision about whether they're going along with the president in a primary or on a given issue. They may go with him in some cases, but they don't have to be afraid of bucking the president.
Is that a serious consideration right now? David, you think people are wondering, oh boy, what do we do? Do you think candidates, lawmakers who are up in 2018 are really thinking about should they go along with this president's agenda? Should they have him on the campaign trail? Should they sign on with this?
Okay, I agree with Bob. They may want him in a primary and maybe not in a general, but the point is, with the president this week, with his coattails so short, they can make their own decision. They don't have to live in fear of going, crossways or sideways with the president. They can make their decision based on what they think the demographics of their district and the issues that are near and dear to their district matters, not so much staying right on track with President Trump, because President Trump has wounded himself over the last year. And they know it, voters know it, the White House knows it.
Self-inflicted.
Yeah.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it. April, stick around, please, because when we come back, I want to talk about how black voters, especially black women, made the difference in Doug Jones' stunning election win. We'll be right back. Democrat Doug Jones' stunning victory in Alabama last night shocked some seasoned political observers, and his overwhelming support from black voters, especially black women, may have been the key. April Ryan is back with me. Also joining me now, CNN political commentators Joseph Pinion and Angela Rye. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. It's been an interesting 24 hours, to say the least. Angela, last night, during a special election in December, African-American voters eclipsed that and made up 29% of all voters. And then Jones won them by 96% to 4%. In 2012, on Election Day, black voters comprised 28% of the total Alabama electorate and went 95% to 4% for then President Barack Obama. Is this a wake-up call for Democrats? What do you think?
I think it's major. And one of the things that I haven't heard talked about too much is just a moment to give credit where credit is due. There is an amazing member of Congress in Alabama who worked her behind off for Doug Jones, and that's Congresswoman Terry Sewell. Terry Sewell has an amazing record. She's done just yeoman's work in trying to protect Alabama citizens' voting rights. She's been pushing the Voting Rights Amendments Act since last Congress, and actually since 2013 when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965, making it harder for states like Alabama to be pre-cleared. Saying all of that to say, what happened yesterday is black people worked in the space that they do best, and that's in resilience, right? They worked in spite of the fact that there were licensing places closing in their areas so that they couldn't have the proper ID to go vote. They worked in spite of. And I think that people need to be commended for that. I don't think that Democrats can take credit for this. I think that black people can.
Well, I think that it was also a lot of the people who went down there and this turnout the vote effort by African American and many prominent African Americans. It was kind of below the radar because they didn't want to look like they were outsiders coming in to tell people what to do. So it was kind of it was a surprise to many, obviously.
Well, and I don't think it was a surprise. I think that what you saw is whether it was Kamala Harris or Cory Booker or Barack Obama's robocall, it's folks, again, rising to the occasion, not waiting on the Democratic Party to give specific instructions, not waiting on Doug Jones' campaign to give specific instructions, but knowing that we got to do what we got to do. And again, shout out to Terry Sewell.
Okay, so listen, put this into perspective for us, April. As a reporter who happens to be a woman of color, black women were 17% of the electorate yesterday, and they voted for Jones 98% to 2%.
Right. Well, when you look at the community, African American women, we are becoming the highest. We're becoming increasing in number as the head of household, as the sole provider. And when you have people like Roy Moore talking the way he's talking, the stakes are at the highest they can be. And you have to go out and fight back. And the way they fought back was through their vote. Terry Sewell, like Angela said, really worked hard. And, you had people come in like Cory Booker, who is a rock star of the party, whose mother has roots in Alabama, who came in. They wanted to reach each one. And I remember talking to Terry Sewell over the weekend, and she said that we need the African American vote. She said we don't have the numbers to put it all the way over the top, but if they had not had that African American vote, and particularly the women, as well as the moderate Republicans, it would not be Doug Jones the winner. So when it comes to issues for women, for minority women, the stakes are high and they know it. We are the ones who go to the polls. Yeah. We are the ones who lead the household. We are the decision makers a lot of times in the home. So they wanted to make a decision and they made the decision through their vote, and it's clear it's Doug Jones.
It's frustrating to, I've heard over the last 24 hours, to many African American voters because they feel that, especially within the last 2 or 3 years, all they've heard on television is what rural white voters and working class voter, which now means white voters, what this person says, or the unheard Trump voter, when the people who are out now really in the election and determining the election since 2016 are voters of color. There's a frustration there, Joseph.
Well, I think that, to me, when you look at what we're facing right now, first and foremost, I think we have to give credit to not the Democratic Party, but as Angela said, to black people. I think that ultimately, one thing that I haven't heard people talk about is the Trump effect on the black vote. I think sometimes the Trump administration acts as if black people cannot see them, like as if somehow we cannot hear them, we cannot see them. So when you get on the Air Force One and fly down to Pensacola, literally the day before the Civil Rights Museum opening, to campaign for a man who said that the last time this nation was great was during slavery, to go to the U.S. Senate on behalf of a state that still to this day celebrates Robert E. Lee Day in conjunction with Martin Luther King Day, and act as if that's not going to have an effect on the African American vote, I think that is short-sighted.
You said that this was a warning shot yesterday across the bow for the GOP that you have been warning, that people have been warning them about for years now.
For years. I think if you
about the black vote.
About the black vote. I think when you look at the fact, even the Growth and Opportunity Project, I said earlier that someone needs to call Reince Priebus and figure out what file he left those documents in, because ultimately at the end of the day, we have been talking about this for years. And so again, when you sit here and act as if calling NFL players kneeling SOBs, and act as if that doesn't have an effect on black mothers going to the polls who are recognizing those individuals who are kneeling on behalf of their sons and their daughters, and think that's not the reason why turnout in that black belt is going up, I think you're being short-sighted. I think the fact that when you start talking about the fact that you have individuals out here in Selma, Alabama going to the polls in record numbers, and you don't think that has anything to do with the fact that you have Congressman Lewis who disavowed the president after he got battered and bruised and bloodied on Edward Pettus Bridge, I think again you're being short-sighted. And so I think that hopefully, finally, if we can expect the president to change, then certainly the party must at least acknowledge the truths that we have spent millions of dollars to confront, which is that you have to start dealing with these issues with communities of color much differently.
Well, the person in the White House who was supposed to help with that vote, turning out the black vote, the liaison, fired the day after the stunning loss, or I should say, she said she resigned. the night of the stunning loss, and I'm talking about Omarosa. I would say you're fired, but they're saying she resigned. We'll talk about that.
It
when
was
we come back.
both.
One of the president's most vocal and controversial supporters, a former Apprentice contestant, Omarosa Manigault, out of a job at the White House. Back with me now, April Ryan, Angela Rye, and Joseph Pinion. So April, today, Manigault Newman, that's her married name now, resigned to pursue other opportunities. The president tweeted thanks to her. Everyone is being gracious, but there is reporting by you, also by CBS News, that Omarosa was fired by John Kelly. Why did she have to go?
Well, according to my sources, and you know, Don, we didn't get too much sleep last night, and about 6 after we were doing the Roy Moore show. But what happened this morning, 6 a.m., I'm starting to get texts from sources, and it continued from so many different people, so many different sectors who had credible sources, people who were high-ranking Republicans to people close to the White House. I mean, people who knew her. I mean, it was a lot. So what ultimately we found out is that last night, General Kelly ran into her or approached her at one of the White House Christmas parties. And he said, I need to talk to you. And ultimately, she said, I want to have full access that I did before. I want to be able to walk in to the president's office. I want to be able to go in and out of meetings as I please, and I also want to be able to do my own thing. And he said, look, he said, he told her, this is part of the problem, that I understand that you're in the president's ear. She's been calling and trying to influence the president, going around his boundaries and his parameters. And so then she said, well, if I don't get what I want, there'll be hell to pay. And he said, okay, there's hell. And that's what started it all off.
So this all happened last night. And so here's what last night. Okay, so listen, there are reports again from you and from other news organizations that she was escorted off the property, that they took her security clearance, what have you. The Secret Service is tweeting. It says the Secret Service was not involved in the termination process of Ms. Manigault Newman or the escort off the complex, which seems to me, if you say, looks like they're confirming, because they're saying they were not involved in the escort. They're not saying she wasn't escorted.
Who escorted her off the property?
Our only involvement in this matter was to deactivate the individual's pass, which grants access to the complex. So this gives us more information about what happened here. You think?
Yeah, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders said, and I tried to get her to confirm it early this morning, and when I emailed her, they in turn ran to AP and the Huffington Post. But I said, okay, you say she resigned, and there's a resignation letter with her signature, but it was a negotiated resignation, but there was still drama that ultimately she was terminated. The resignation, she was supposed to leave on January 20th. Right. Secret Service took her, deactivated her hard pass where she can't get in. Yeah. So the question is she being paid out through the 20th? What? But
well,
she
I'm
is
glad
no
you said
longer,
that. Let me put this, and just for the sake, because of time. Okay, so let me get this up. This is a statement. It's from someone, a former administration official told CNN this. People have long been unsure what she did at the White House, what value she brought. Many of her colleagues are elated. What was her role at the White House, Joseph?
I think that it's unfortunate that things have transpired in this way. I think putting any feelings that people have about Omarosa to the side, I think that, again, when we just talk about African-American turnout through the roof in Alabama last night, and then you literally, while you're losing that election, turning probably the most visible African-American figure you have in that administration out the door.
Well, no, but Joseph, terrible. That was her job. What? Part of her job was to get black turnout, but to vote for the Republican candidate or for the president's agenda, and she didn't accomplish that. You don't think that's a fireable offense?
I think that meetings are not access, and I think that, you know, as much as I think it is well documented that there's been a little friction in the hood between Omarosa and a lot of people, I think that the reality is that if there is no perceived credibility at the administration to be able to say that these meetings will turn into actual results for the people, then it doesn't really matter who you have in that job. It's going to be very difficult, almost impossible, for people to actually take that person seriously.
What about Omarosa's perceived credibility, Angela? Did she have any?
I don't believe she had any credibility. I think here's the tough part. If she's the most visible person that African Americans are to rely on in this administration, tell me why she was sitting in EEOB instead of in the West Wing. Tell me why she didn't have an office there. If you are going to tell me that she was the highest ranking, she certainly was paid well. But if you're going to tell me that, you tell me why she wasn't able to influence any policy to ensure that black people, communities of color, and low-income communities were taken care of. Whether we're talking about health care, we talk about tax reform. We certainly weren't protected in any of those. She even had HBCUs under her bailiwick. And if that's the case, you tell me why this president thought the HBCUs, well, hold on. You tell me why you think that this president thought that HBCUs are unconstitutional. Then you tell me what she was doing that was helpful to us, and I will call you a liar.
Why was she was, let's be honest, she was head of...
What? Don, you just hard stopped.
I'm just like, how I was going to say this. Look, all right, let's just put it this way. Black people didn't like Omarosa. They thought that she was divisive. No. They thought that they didn't understand why she was there. She was a former apprentice contestant. Listen, he can hire whoever he wanted, but if you're going to hire someone to be, and part of her main job was to have outreach to African Americans, and she had no credibility there, why on earth would you do that?
Well, I think it's just, to defend everything is to be credible on nothing. Right, and so that's the biggest issue that we have here. And I think that, to me, it's less about actually being able to talk about the deficiencies of Omarosa as far as her advocacy for the black community, and just talking about the deficiencies of this administration to actually have a credible interest in what is occurring in African American communities.
Yeah. Go ahead.
But let me say this. It is important to talk about the deficiencies of this person who was in this position when you have a president who is taking the issue of taking a knee and making it about the flag and soldiers versus the issue of police-involved shootings, what it was. Also the issue of Charleston. She is supposed to be the voice of reason for the black community, the liaison between the black community and the president, and it continues. The tension between this administration and the black community is at its height, and she is there to help be his liaison, and it did not smooth out anything.
I would submit to you that she's not, though. I would submit to you the fact that in name only.
But this is what
right?
they
and this is
right.
That's the whole
exactly.
And I think that
That's
is the point. And to me, again, so ultimately, on some base level, to me, Omarosa is irrelevant, right? And to me, that's what I'm trying to.
So what do you mean in name
No,
only?
it's not. No, it's not, because that person was also supposed to go on the Hill and work with the Congressional Black Caucus. Instead, she was picking fights with Cedric Richmond, the head of the Congressional Black Caucus.
She was
trying
also
to
calling
incite him to
herself
fight.
the honorable.
Well,
she was calling herself the honorable and putting the address block of her letter at the end of the letter. Like, I don't even know who taught her that. So she's so irrelevant, she doesn't even know how to address a letter. And you talking about relevance, you should have a place near the principal. Again, she's sitting on the outskirts in EEOB. For those of you who don't know, there's a separate building.
And
there's
a
a separate building. That's where she was seated. Hold on, Joseph, one more thing. One more thing. The last thing I have. If she was supposed to help black people, you tell me why she was boo-booing on the people in the administration. In the White House, there were folks that she was shutting the door on. Black people, there ain't but a couple of them. I'm sorry to be airing y'all out. But she was even not going out of her way to make it difficult for these folks to do their jobs. I'm not supportive of the Trump administration, but I definitely don't support someone who will work diligently to close doors on people trying to be successful in their career.
That's the last word.
Don,
I got to go, but she's gone now. So, there you go. Thank you, everyone. When we come right back, Rod Rosenstein testifying in front of the House Judiciary Committee today. We're going to tell you what the Deputy Attorney General is saying about Robert Mueller and whether he should be fired. The Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein flat out telling a House committee today that he has seen no reason to fire Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. Here to discuss, CNN National Security Analyst Steve Hall, retired Chief of CIA Russian Operations. He joins us via Skype. Also, CNN National Security and Legal Analyst Susan Hennessy and contributor Garrett Graff, author of The Threat Matrix, Inside Robert Mueller's FBI and the War on Global Terror. Good evening, all. Susan, you first. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein appeared before the House Judiciary Committee today to defend Robert Mueller and his investigation against claims of political bias. Rosenstein said in no uncertain terms that Mueller should not be removed from the investigation. How good was Rosenstein's defense, do you think, of Mueller today?
Right, so I think he gave a really robust and sort of appropriate defense of Mueller, both the integrity of the investigation and Mueller as an individual. He stopped short in some places of sort of a full defense of the FBI writ large. He was given the opportunity, for example, to express confidence in FBI Director Christopher Wray. He did that, but then didn't punted on the chance to also express confidence in General Counsel James Baker. So a little bit of a sort of a moderated approach. Obviously, he's trying to play it pretty careful in front of Congress, but I think the message is really unambiguous. Rod Rosenstein, who's the individual actually responsible for firing Mueller, sees absolutely no reason to do so. He's perfectly satisfied with the scope and integrity
He said he
of the
was the perfect choice. He said Mueller was a perfect choice for running the investigation. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, look, it's hard to imagine who else might have been able to serve in this role, right? So, considering sort of the arc of Mueller's career, this is an individual who was George W. Bush's FBI director. He was so popular and respected in the Bureau and on Capitol Hill that Barack Obama actually sought special legislation in order to extend his term past the 10-year term, right? So this is an individual with really strong bipartisan credibility, long career in law enforcement, a real sort of sterling reputation for integrity. Hard to imagine the very, very short list of people who could play this really difficult role.
So, Steve, Democratic Senator Joe Manchin was asked about the possibility of Mueller being fired earlier today, and here's what he had to say.
I would hope to think he's safe. If not, then, pardon the expression, all hell will break loose.
What does that mean?
That means that I think there will be an uprising from members of both parties, knowing this is a good man. And you're taking a good man out, you must be taking him out for political reasons, not for the law or the letter of the law. As we are a rule of law. That's how we rule each other, and we live by that. And this is a man that will enforce it.
Do you agree with Manchin?
I do, and I'm concerned about what he said about this sort of uprising, because I think if you go back to what the Russians are hoping and what the plan is for all of this, way back, last year when this whole thing started, was to cause this divisiveness and cause this polarization inside of our democracy. And I think what you saw in that room today was a lot of that. As long as our politicians continue to rise to the bait that Russia has set out for them and sort of make this whole thing a serious political issue, we're sort of giving easy wins. It reminds me of a lot of the developing countries that I served in, where the important part of the political system was not getting to the truth, but was this blind belief in your president or your party leaders. And we've got to recognize that this is not a Republican or Democrat thing. It's an American thing. And I didn't see a lot of that American piece, except from Rosenstein himself, I think, today.
Yeah. Garrett, Rosenstein had a message for those claiming that Mueller's investigation has been tainted. Here's what he had to say.
We recognize we have employees with political opinions, and it's our responsibility to make sure those opinions do not influence their actions. Pardon me. And so I believe that Director Mueller understands that, and that he is running that office appropriately, recognizing that people have political views, but ensuring that those views are not in any way a factor in how they conduct themselves in office.
So, Garrett, do you think that his words today could have been a message to Republicans, maybe the president himself?
Well, I think what you saw Rod Rosenstein try to make was a defense of the institutions and the systems and the processes that we have in place, which is absolutely correct for him to do, which is, it's not that humans don't have opinions. It's not that humans don't express opinions. But we have a system and a process that ensures with checks and balances that those opinions do not influence the outcome. And this is something that actually Bob Mueller has been remarkably attentive to throughout his career. When he was FBI director, the special agent in charge of the New Orleans field office at one point made an offhand comment one morning in the media that he might consider someday entering politics. And Mueller removed him from office by lunchtime that day, before even the Justice Department could call Mueller and ask what was going on.
Everyone stay with me. When we come back, Rod Rosenstein, not the only one in the hot seat today, Donald Trump Jr., I should say, in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee for about 9 hours. And it wasn't even the first day-long interview on the Hill. I want you all to weigh in on that when we come right back. We'll be back right after this. President's son on the congressional hot seat again today. Back with me, Steve Hall, Susan Hennessy, and Garrett Graff. So, Susan, Donald Trump Jr. was questioned by staffers for the Senate Intelligence Committee for approximately 9 hours today. Why do you think they brought him back, and what more do they want to know from him?
Yes, it's certainly a long day. Not all that surprising that they have a lot of questions for Don Jr. I mean, if you think about it, sort of Don Jr. is not only at the center of a lot of different sort of issues related to the Russia investigation. So, right, he's the individual who organized the sort of infamous Trump Tower meeting. You know, sent the email, "If it's what you say it is, I love it." He's also the head of his father's business. Right, Trump has still not divested from the Trump Organization. Certainly, the committees are going to be looking into questions related to potential financial conflicts of interest. And then, you know, Donald Trump Jr. has also sort of dabbled in some Russia-related policy issues. So during the campaign, he gave a speech for a Russia-backed think tank in Europe on sort of Syria policy, an issue that I don't think Don Jr. is an expert on, for which he was paid up to $50,000 reportedly. So there's a huge range of questions and issues that this committee is going to want to get into. So not surprising that they would bring him back, and not surprising that they'd take that full 9 hours to sort of walk down every possible path here.
So you're not surprised that they brought him back for questioning by various investigations?
No, I don't think it's surprising that they brought him back. One of sort of the outstanding questions is how forthcoming he's being. So before the HPSI earlier this week or late last week, he declined to answer some questions about sort of conversations with his father, somewhat strangely asserting attorney-client privilege, not really clear what the grounds for that were. So is he actually being forthcoming with the committees? Is he answering the questions that they're asking?
Yeah. Steve, Senator Mark Warner, who's a member of the Senate Intel Committee, has said that he wants Don Jr. to come back and answer questions from senators themselves. What is the difference between having staffers and senators questioning Trump Jr.?
Well, there is a difference, and I was always surprised when I was working with intelligence oversight committees, congressional committees, at the depth of understanding to the level of detail that the professional staffers actually had. So I know there were questions earlier about, well, you know, geez, are staffers up to this task, or, you know, shouldn't it be the members? I think the answer is a lot of times the staffers are sort of the members' brains on a lot of really detailed issues. And so it doesn't surprise me that it would have been senior professional staffers who would have been getting precisely to some of the questions that Susan was just alluding to. It is important, of course, that members, because at the end of the day, they are the ones who are the elected officials, and it is important that they get in there and have their own questions. But a lot of times staffers provide the research, the background, the depth of understanding that can then allow the members to really get, weed out the stuff that they're not interested in. And in a counterintelligence investigation and in the illegal investigation like this, the financial piece of it, it can all be extremely complicated. And sometimes just weeding it out to the 3 to the 5 most important things is something that those professional staffers can do, and then the members can follow up on that. So it doesn't surprise me that they were in for a long time today.
Garrett, do you think that this will be the last time Don Jr. is called upon to answer questions for lawmakers?
I would be shocked if it is, in part because I don't think that any of these investigations are close to wrapping up, no matter the president's lawyers' repeated assertions that all of this will be over by Christmas or the end of the year. I think we are looking at a process on Bob Mueller's special counsel investigation that is likely going to extend at least another year. Even if there are not that many additional cases that we see come out of it. And I think that the Senate and the House both seem like they have a lot of runway left ahead of them.
Yeah. Does a year seem like a long time to you with an investigation like this, Susan?
No, I think Garrett's right. We're looking at a year from now, sort of at a minimum. The other thing to think about whenever you're thinking about the congressional investigations, which of course are different from Robert Mueller's investigation, that we're just talking about the timeline that it would take for them to put together a report. You have to tack on probably 6 months at a minimum to go through all of the declassification hurdles. So this is going to be a very, very long time before there is an actual public congressional report that's been issued.
Steve, I'm wondering what this does to have your kids, one of your kids, your namesake, have to go and answer all of these questions. I wonder what that does to, Donald Trump, the president, and the father.
You know, having a kid myself, I mean, it's difficult to imagine them sitting in that room, you know, for 9 hours, really being asked a whole bunch of very detailed, probably very unpleasant questions. It's gotta, you know, it must take a toll. That said, you know, I agree with what Susan said earlier. Donald Trump Jr. is a key player, and he was made a key player by his father. You know, one of the key things that came up during the Rosenstein testimony today was the question as to, was there any collusion, or has anybody seen any collusion? And I think Donald Trump Jr.'s comments about, yes, I'm interested in that derogatory information on Hillary Clinton, you know, if it's not collusion in and of itself, it seems to be an intent to try to get there. And that's, you know, that's a very serious thing, which is why I'm sure they spent as much time as they did with him today, Don.
Yeah, and if there was a divestment of the businesses and there wasn't so much, at least cross between the business and the campaign, then maybe the kids or Don Jr. wouldn't be in this position, as advisors have been saying all along, and political analysts. Thank you all. I appreciate it. When we come back, will President Trump pay a political price in the wake of Roy Moore's defeat? And whatever happened to Steve Bannon's war on the GOP? This is CNN Tonight. I'm Don Lemon. It is 11 p.m. here on the East Coast. We're live with new developments tonight on the political earthquake that shook the country. Democrat Doug Jones winning the Alabama Senate race, defeating Republican Roy Moore, and accused child molester. Moore has released a new video statement tonight, and we're going to bring that to you in just a moment. Plus, Doug Jones' victory to the Senate began as a young man in an Alabama courtroom observing the trial of a ringleader of the Birmingham church bombers. And it came full circle when the sister of one of the victims campaigned for Jones. I'm going to talk with her tonight. But let's get right to New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof and CNN contributor Frank Bruni, also a Times columnist. Good evening, gentlemen. So as I said in the open here, Roy Moore's out with this new video message. He still refuses to concede. Let's look at it.
I want to thank all of you who have stood with me in this very important battle for the future of our country. We are indeed in a struggle to preserve our republic, our civilization, and our religion, and to set free a suffering humanity. And the battle rages on. In this race, we have not received the final count to include military and provisional ballots. This has been a very close race, and we are awaiting certification by the Secretary of State.
Secretary of State did an interview last night saying he didn't think that that would change anything, but, you know, if you want to go through all of this. I mean, listen, he certainly doesn't want to seem like he wants to ride off in the sunset on Sassy's horse, does he?
Well, he's been defying reality his whole career as a judge and as a politician. But, you know, I must say that I think one thing I find hardening about the race is that this is a time that is so polarized, and a time when there are, you know, these enormous accusations against news institutions and debate about whether there are any common facts for the country. And I thought that this election actually showed that facts do matter. I mean, that, you know, it was because of some tremendous Washington Post reporting that was unassailable that changed the outcome of this race. And it showed that for all these assaults on truth, actually facts do matter. And in the same way, our national conversation is dominated by some similar reporting in the New York Times about Harvey Weinstein. That even in 2017, with this polarization, at some level, great reporting and facts do matter.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see, I mean, even as every single day, we wonder who's next when you mention Harvey Weinstein, when it comes to that particular issue. But Frank, let's talk a little bit more about what Nick just said, and facts and reporting, because you're out with a new column on the Alabama race. And just let me read a part of it. You said Alabamians provided a partial answer on Tuesday showing that there are limits to what voters will tolerate in terms of lies they'll believe, the vices they'll ignore, and the distance they'll stray from civilized norms. Moore, an accused child molester who sugarcoated slavery and seemed intent on some sort of extreme Christian theocracy, was simply too far. I was reading this morning on the airplane. I was exhausted and I wanted to take a nap, but I couldn't stop reading your column because I found it fascinating, and I think you're right. Was a line drawn last night? And what does that mean for President Trump, who continues to tweet out inappropriate things?
Well, it did feel to me like a line was drawn last night. I think most of us have lived through this first year, and I do mean most Americans have lived through this first year of the Trump presidency, and we have seen him behave in office in a way that we haven't seen a president behave before. We've seen him, act in indecent ways. We've seen him seem to privilege himself and his fellow plutocrats over everyone else. And we've wondered, at what point is there a pushback? At what point do we see evidence that Americans are saying we won't stand for that? And I think it is just so interesting and so encouraging that pushback came from Alabama, which if you were making a list of the reddest states in the country, Alabama would be at or near the top of that list. And I think this outcome says that yes, Roy Moore was a step too far, but that Roy Moore is a mirror and a sort of proxy for Trumpism was also a step too far. I mean, Donald Trump put his political muscle, late, but he did so behind this candidacy. It didn't make a difference, and I think it's impossible not to see him as pretty seriously diminished by what happened in Alabama.
Let's also, though, acknowledge that the pushback, is fairly modest in the sense that what it shows is that if you have an unpopular Republican who has a history of molesting 14-year-old girls, then that person may lose a squeaker. Well, at the end of the day, it was astonishing to me that white women still voted by 29 percentage points for Moore.
Well, Doug Jones did better with women than Democrats traditionally do in Alabama. Roy Moore, it's hard to imagine a more unacceptable candidate. But we're talking about a state that went for Donald Trump by 30 points. I went back and looked at other Senate races, recent gubernatorial races, going back the last 2 decades, almost always the Republican wins by something like 30 points. So it's impossible not to look at that sort of margin and at the fact that Doug Jones won and say this is about, yes, what a flawed candidate, flawed is too soft a word for it, Roy Moore is, but I think it's about things that are even bigger than that.
Let's talk. This president doesn't like anything to do with the former president. Not at all. He doesn't like Barack Obama, but they do have something in common. They're both very popular with their bases, but they have trouble turning people out to go vote for candidates they support. They both do. Barack Obama had trouble with Hillary Clinton. Now he's had trouble with Roy Moore. He had trouble with Luther Strange. He had trouble in Virginia.
I do think there is still a profound difference there, and that basically the problem for President Trump is that he hasn't he does have a real base, but he hasn't institutionalized that, and the Republican Party is completely torn apart, including by people who he has brought up, like Steve Bannon. So he doesn't have an institutional base to try to carry on his revolution, and I think that's one reason why now the last 3 candidates he's supported have successively failed, Roy Moore, Luther Strange, and Ed Gillespie. And I think it's his difficulty creating traction for moving this beyond him.
Yeah. We cannot forget Steve Bannon in all of this because he backed Roy Moore. He was down there campaigning for him. I want you both to listen to Republican Congressman Peter King, what he had to say about Bannon this morning.
This guy does not belong on the national stage. He looks like some disheveled drunk that wandered onto the political stage. He does not represent anything that I stand for. I consider myself a conservative Republican. I consider myself an Irish Catholic. And he sort of parades himself out there with his weird alt-right views that he has. And to me, it's demeaning the whole governmental and political process.
That interview was with my colleague Chris Cuomo. Cuomo said it this morning. He said those are some fighting words. How big of a hit was last night that loss to Bannon's nationalism brand, Frank?
A huge, huge hit. And it's interesting because I've been hearing for weeks, even months now, from Republicans that Steve Bannon's influence and his profile are way, way overrated. That Steve Bannon has done this expert job, partly through the way he looks and personal idiosyncrasies, of turning himself into this very prominent media character. And Republicans have been telling me for a while, show me the evidence that Steve Bannon can actually make magic happen at the polls. Show me a candidate that he has truly made and not just grafted himself onto mid-course. And now Moore is such a candidate. Moore is a candidate, and obviously existed before Bannon, but Bannon got on the Moore train early. He wrote it prominently. He was down there, speaking in a very fiery way on Moore's behalf, and it did not work out. And I think you're going to see more and more Republicans in the party say, wait a second, we should not be terrified by Steve Bannon. We should be simply defying Steve Bannon or even ignoring him.
Nick, as somebody was playing, I was asking you if we put too much stock in this Bannon character and his influence.
Yeah, and I frankly think that we in the media maybe overinflated him. And now he's deflating. I do think that while his power to build is limited, that he does have some power to destroy, and that by supporting some very far-right candidates in primaries, he may tug some candidates to the right and make them less competitive in general elections in 2018.
Well, Lindsey Graham, who's been one of the president's sharpest critics at times, but then he also stands by him as well. He tweeted this about last night's race. He says, when it comes to Alabama politics, Steve Bannon should have followed President Donald Trump's lead in supporting Luther Strange. Trump's instincts on the Alabama race proved to be correct. It was only last night that Senator Lindsey Graham and Roy Moore, they were on a no-fly list for a mall, right? Why change? Or he said that. He said, I don't think you're the right character or something when you're on a no-fly list for a mall.
Yeah, but I mean, Lindsey Graham was quite critical in the past of President Trump, but in the last few months, I think he's really come around. And so describing, I thought the takeaway of this tweet was saying that President Trump's instincts were essentially right, and I thought that was more flattery than analysis.
Well, it's interesting all along because I thought that that's what the president might say about Frank, about Strange when he lost, or about Roy Moore, saying, listen, I'm the one who backed Strange, and then finally after the election he said it. He didn't say it when Roy Moore was out there campaigning, but he says it after the election. He's trying to distance himself, and that came pretty quick, like almost immediately.
Yeah, but his statements are all over the place. If you remember, after Strange lost, he was enraged at the congressional leaders who had said, you got to get behind this guy, and he felt betrayed by that. And now he's saying, hey, I said all along we should have done Strange. I mean, Donald Trump says whatever he needs to in the moment to appear invincible, to kind of perpetuate his illusion of infallibility. He'll be saying something different tomorrow, and he'll be saying something different again a week from now.
Yeah, he was like this morning, Roy who? Thank you, guys.
Right.
Appreciate it. Doug Jones' incredible journey to the U.S. Senate began 40 years ago as a law student. The trial of the KKK member who bombed a Birmingham church shaped his political career decades later. When we come back, you're going to meet the sister of a girl who lost her life in that bombing and hear what compelled her to campaign for Jones. I want you to sit down and listen to this. It's really important that you pay attention. In last night's historic special Senate election, the importance of black voters cannot be overstated. Doug Jones' victory was stunning, but if you look into his history and the state's history, there is an explanation as to how a white son of the segregated South pulled off this upset 11 o'clock Sunday morning. It was on September 15, 1963, Birmingham's historic 16th Street Baptist Church. Worship is just about to start. 5 young girls are putting on choir robes in the church basement. That's when a bomb planted under the front step of the church detonates, killing 4 of those little girls, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Addie Mae Collins, and Cynthia Diane Wesley. The 5th girl, Sarah Jean Collins, loses an eye. The outrage is a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. Though several members of the Ku Klux Klan bragged about their role in the bombing, there are no charges filed, no indictments, no arrests, until 7 years after those girls were killed. Alabama's incoming Attorney General Bill Baxley reopens the case. He begins a dogged investigation. Baxley receives numerous threats, one from a white supremacist calling him, among other things, a traitor to his race. He writes back this. He says, "Dear Dr. Fields, my response to your letter of February 19, 1976 is, kiss my ass." The investigation pays off, and in 1977, Baxley wins a conviction against the bombing's ringleader, Robert Chambliss, but his accomplices remain at large. A young law school student is so mesmerized by the trial, he skips classes to be in the courtroom. Decades later, he recalls the closing arguments, which put Chambliss behind bars for life. What does all this have to do with Doug Jones? Well, that young man playing hooky from law school in Alabama's incoming Senator, Doug Jones. On his way to making history as U.S. Senator, he helped right one of history's most egregious wrongs, and in spite of pulling off an epic upset last night, he says prosecuting the 2 Klansmen bombers is the most important thing he has ever done. Bringing justice to men living freely for all those years. And that brings us to another moment where history intersected last night.
He will be the next United States Senator from Alabama. He beats Roy Moore in this really, really exciting contest. Doug Jones comes from behind, takes the lead, and now CNN projects he will be the next senator. First time in 25 years that a Democrat will be...
Lisa McNair, whose sister Denise was one of those little girls murdered for no reason, but for the color of her skin, is at Jones's campaign headquarters when the race is called. She thinks, oh, thank God. God has not forgotten about us. It's going to be okay. You know, I know she thinks that because she joins us now, and we're going to talk about it. Lisa, so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. How you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me, Don. This is awesome.
Why do you think God had forgotten about you?
I don't think God ever really forgets about us, but sometimes we do feel that way when we don't see him or hear him for long periods of time.
You know, a lot of people know the story, and a lot of people don't know the story about last night. But as I was reading it, you can't help become emotional, and then you realize just how that whole thing came full circle. And if you don't believe there is a God, this story will certainly make you know that there is one. You told my producer that you just knew Doug Jones was going to win, that you felt it in your spirit and your soul. So tell me what you were feeling last night when he indeed did win.
Oh, it was just confirmation for what I was feeling and what I have believed for, several weeks now. I mean, I was watching the campaign and watching how hard they worked and how committed they were, and the time and the energy and effort, people from all over were putting in, sacrificing, losing sleep, just putting in the work. And that's really what it takes.
Yeah. When you heard...
And I just felt like...
I'm sorry. Sorry, there's a delay. Go on. Finish your statement, please.
And I just felt like God couldn't let us lose this one. It just was too important. It just would put everybody's mind back where they were back in the 50s and the 60s. And that was so painful. I just felt like we've come so much further. People in Birmingham and Alabama are so much better than that. And surely we've started to learn from the lessons of that time and don't want to go back to that time.
How did it make you feel when you heard someone like Roy Moore saying that Doug Jones was soft on crime, considering what he did when it came to the church bombings, and saying that he had no connection to the black community?
He obviously didn't know what he was talking about. That's all I can say, because those are facts, that Doug does have connection to the black community, and he was a U.S. attorney, and he prosecuted the bombers, so that was just he did not have the facts.
Your father was a state legislator in Alabama, and he knew Doug Jones when he was first starting out. Doug Jones has since become close with you and your family. What kind of a senator do you think he's going to be?
He's going to be amazing. It's going to be awesome, because Doug is very tenacious, and he's very smart, and he's very fair. I often think of, and he's compassionate. I often think of the day when the last bomber was convicted and the verdict came in. And I remember the feelings I felt and how I was just crying and so consumed with tears and gratefulness that, the killer was going to go to jail. And then suddenly I decided I needed to look up at the lawyers that were at the table, Doug and the other team, and they were also weeping. It wasn't just a little tear, they were weeping. And for me, that let me know that it meant as much to them to convict them as it did to the families. And I will never forget that.
Yeah.
So he's a man of compassion.
According to the exit polls, 98% of black women who cast ballots voted for Jones. 93% of black men, the black women of Alabama, are really a force to be reckoned with right now. I'm wondering if you think that African-American women have been underestimated, because if you watch the news reports, if you watch all the news reports, They interviewed a lot of Roy Moore, even here on CNN. We interviewed a lot of Roy Moore supporters who were talking about why they liked him, why they weren't going to change their votes. But you didn't see a lot of African Americans, and especially women, who really made a difference in this election.
Well, I think sometimes we're often underestimated, but we have always been a force in this world and in this country. The black woman is amazing, and she has to take care of her family. She has to take care of herself. I have to take care of my aging parents, and you have to do it with a smile on your face and keep on pushing for decades and centuries. And we have always been that way, and we're going to continue to be that way. We're a force.
Yeah, and you carried black men on your back for a long time as well, and don't think that goes unrecognized. Thank you, Lisa.
Well, thank you.
Best of luck to you.
Thank you.
All right. When I come down, I'll come see you. Thank you very much. When we come back, I'll be joined by a Democratic representative from Texas who is challenging Ted Cruz for his seat in the Senate. After the big upset in Alabama, can a Dem win in Texas? Doug Jones' stunning victory over Roy Moore in Alabama, one of the reddest states in the country, giving new fire today to Democrats hoping to take back the Senate from Republicans. One of those is Congressman Beto O'Rourke. He's a Democrat who is challenging Senator Ted Cruz, a Texas Republican, and he joins me now. Good evening, Congressman. Thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us. You're trying to seize the moment from last night's epic Republican loss. You sent out a fundraising letter to your supporters saying, next up, Texas 2018. And you write, if you weren't sure if our campaign to take on Ted Cruz was possible, you have to know it is now. Why do you think Texas is next?
You know, I'm a lifelong Texan, fourth generation. I've been traveling this state for the last year, listening to people all over Austin, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, El Paso, the places you'd expect to see a Democrat. But importantly, in Abilene, in Wichita Falls, in Lufkin, in Nacogdoches, everyone wants something better for our state, and they're willing to work for it. They're committed to it, and they're coming out in record numbers to our town halls, to our rallies, and they've helped us outraise Ted Cruz, the sitting junior U.S. Senator. The first quarter we fundraised, we raised more than $500,000 more than Ted Cruz, and not a dime of it came from PACs or corporations or special interests, just people, and the lion's share from Texas.
He is deeply unpopular. I mean, even in traditionally Republican Texas. Why do you sense the time is right to defeat him now?
Yeah, by contrast with Alabama, Roy Moore, a known child predator, had a 41% favorability rating in Alabama. Ted Cruz in Texas has a 38% favorability rating. Hillary Clinton lost Texas by 9%. She lost Alabama by 28%. All 36 congressional districts in Texas today have a Democratic challenger. It's the first time in 25 years. Our state is waking up. Folks know that everything that they care about and that they want in their lives and for their kids is on the line right now. And they're getting off the sidelines and into the game and making something wonderful happen for Texas and something critically important for the United States. But this is a really exciting time to be a Texan.
Listen, I've got to push back here a little bit because there are critics who say that you shouldn't read too much into the Doug Jones winning, that this race was an anomaly because of the kind of candidate that Roy Moore was. What's your response to them?
Well, I'd point them to these favorability ratings. You know, Roy Moore, given everything that everyone in Alabama knew about him, still had a 41% favorable rating. Ted Cruz in Texas has a 38% favorability rating. This is a state, Texas, that is tending Democratic faster than almost any other state in the union. I think only California is going Democratic more quickly than Texas is. And I know it from being on the ground, holding these town halls all across the state of Texas. And it doesn't matter whether folks are Democrats or Republicans or independents, they're coming out. It's like the school teacher in Henrietta, Texas, a Republican who said, if you let Betsy DeVos take my hard-earned public tax dollars out of my public classroom and send it to a private school in the form of a voucher, I'm going to come after you, Beto. She wants to hold me accountable, and I want that accountability. But I had a chance to remind her that Ted Cruz was the 51st vote to confirm Betsy DeVos. This Senate seat matters. And when you have someone who supports Betsy DeVos or Jeff Mateer, the nominee for the federal bench, who called transgender children part of Satan's plan, who believes in conversion therapy, who even Senator Grassley disavowed.
Listen, I understand all of that, and I mean that's that's something that Texas will have to deal with. But I just want to let's stick to the comparisons here, and especially for a nationwide audience. And you have to look at the demographics of Alabama. I'm not sure if Texas has the same demographics, but African American voters made up 29% of the vote in Alabama yesterday, with 98% of black women, 93% of black men casting their ballots for Doug Jones. So what lessons do you think should Democrats take from this when it comes to minority voters, not only in Texas, but around the country?
It means that everyone is important, and we can't write anybody off or, importantly, take anyone for granted. Texas is a state that is 41% Hispanic. We have to be within every community and within the communities of our communities. It means that when I'm in Houston, I'm also in the 5th Ward. I'm in Kashmere Garden. I'm in Greenspoint. I'm in the places that typically people who are in positions of public trust don't go to be held accountable and to listen to those that they want to represent and to serve. When we show up and we listen and we reflect what we learn on the campaign trail, then we have a chance to earn the votes of those that we want to represent. And people have a reason to turn out. So whether you are black, Mexican American, Anglo in Texas, I want to represent you, and I'm coming to your community to listen to you and to hear what you think is most important for Texas and this country in your own voice, and then to turn around and make sure that I'm campaigning on that, and once in the Senate, serving you and being accountable to you.
Yeah.
That's the difference between how I campaign and how I serve, and how Ted Cruz campaigns and how he has failed to serve the people of Texas.
Congressman Beto O'Rourke, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Let's bring in now CNN political analyst Nathan Gonzalez. Nathan, thank you for joining us. After last night, there's going to be a lot of candidates with dreams of doing the impossible now. Randy Bryce is a retired steel worker in Wisconsin. He's running against House Speaker Paul Ryan. He tweeted this out. He said, in close to 24 hours since Doug Jones' victory, our campaign has raised nearly $50,000. This is what a wave looks like. Help us reach our $50,000 goal to send a message heard around the country. This wave is going to crash straight into Paul Ryan. You say defeating someone who is already a U.S. Senator is really tough. It's an uphill battle. So talk to us about that.
Sure. Well, of course, like you said, everyone's going to say, I'm the next Doug Jones. The challenge is that no one else is going to get to run against Roy Moore. You know, the congressman, he makes a compelling case, right, that Texas was closer than Alabama at the presidential level in 2016, and so look what's possible. But I think there's some key differences. The first one is that Roy Moore factor. You know, Ted Cruz is polarizing. Even within his own party, you can find plenty of Republicans in Washington and Texas who don't like him. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a binary choice, and those Republicans who may not like Ted Cruz's style or strategy, political strategy, they don't want Chuck Schumer to be majority leader. Yeah. Also, financially, this is going to be tough for the congressman as well. I mean, he represents El Paso in the far western end of Texas. For the rest of Texas, he has to introduce himself before Republicans introduce him in their own way, and that's going to take money. In the Alabama race, Doug Jones outspent Roy Moore at least 5-1 on television. That's not going to happen in this U.S. Senate race or other Senate races. Democrats aren't going to have that big of a financial advantage. And then from a macro level, when you look at, I think Beto O'Rourke, the congressman would need some outside help from Democratic groups, but those Democratic groups are first going to be focused on the large number, the 10, maybe 12 Democratic senators who are up for re-election. They want to defend those incumbents first, then they move to challenger races, and it just remains to be seen whether there's going to be enough money left to do that.
Nathan, Democrats are riding a new wave of excitement. What should they do to keep this momentum going? Can they?
Well, I mean, the next special election is 3 months from tonight in Pennsylvania's 18th district. That's a western Pennsylvania district that Donald Trump carried. Democrats in Washington now are trying to downplay it and say, well, it's not going to be a big deal. But I think what we know about these special elections so far is that Republicans manage to make them more difficult than they're supposed to be. They end up closer and getting more attention, even if they end up winning them. And so, you know, Democrats, I think they have to keep getting strong candidates in places where they don't have them yet, and they have to keep raising money in order to use that money later on next year when they're actually trying to deliver specific messages to voters.
Nathan, thank you. I appreciate your time.
No problem.
When we come back, the president parading middle-class families out to talk up his tax plan today. But could those families ultimately be hurt by the plan? Everything you need to know about how taxes will hit your wallet next. House and Senate negotiators striking a tentative deal on a tax cut bill. President Trump anxious to have the legislation on his desk, saying it's now just days away.
As a candidate, I promised we would pass a massive tax cut for the everyday working American families who are the backbone and the heartbeat of our country. We want to give you, the American people, a giant tax cut for Christmas. And when I say giant, I mean giant.
When he does that thing, it's always... I want to bring in now senior global economics analyst Rana Foroohar and senior economics analyst Stephen Moore, the former economics advisor to the Trump campaign. Thank you, Stephen.
Now, Don.
So, but I'm going to go to Rana first. So, Rana, seriously though, President Trump says that this deal is a giant tax cut for Christmas to the American people. What do you say to that?
I think that was an incredibly cynical statement. I mean, this tax bill is about a big corporate tax cut, taking the corporate rate down from 35% to 21%, which, by the way, it has to be said, is basically what large corporations are paying right now.
Already, right.
Okay, so this is not some kind of a big, amazing deal that's going to create jobs. And by the way, and Stephen and I have this conversation regularly, tax cuts haven't actually created job growth in this country in 20 years under either administration. In 2001 and 2003 under Bush and later under President Obama, they did not. There are things going on in the economy right now that can't be fixed just by cutting taxes. It's hard work, and I think that what the president's doing is very cynical, really.
So maybe magically it'll do it this time, Stephen. Is that what's happening?
Well, look, I mean, I think the history of tax cuts, I've written books about this. I mean, you look at, remember, Don, we had this conversation last week with that historian who said, well, tax cuts have never worked. Look at the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, and the 60s. You know, John F. Kennedy talked about cutting taxes will help the middle class and grow the economy.
You can't compare
of
the
course,
economy then to the 20s
we saw in my
and
lifetime,
60s to now,
what happened in the 1980s under Reagan. But look,
and even the 80s, it's a different economy. I mean, now when you
look, the economy changed, no question about it. I mean, the economy evolves and changes. We're in a global economy today, you know, and we used to be able to get away with charging 35% and more for our corporations because we weren't competing in this global economy we are today. Now we're competing against China. We're competing against Japan and Germany and Mexico and Canada. And we have to, the goal of this, and as you know, Don, I was involved in this from the beginning with Donald Trump, is to make American companies as competitive as possible so we can beat the pants off of the Chinese and other countries that have been stealing our jobs. And I think this will be good for the economy. By the way, you got to admit, Don, I mean, what's happened with the economy over the last 12 months has been amazing, and the stock market is just booming.
Yeah, I know that this current president should be saying, thank you, President Obama.
Yeah, and also...
Well, thank you for President Obama for not being president anymore, letting the economy expand.
Because for getting us out of a recession and then handing a really good job market and economy
Don,
to
the economy
this
is growing
president.
at 1.5% in Barack Obama's last year in office. A lot of economists said we're headed to a recession. Now we got an economy that's growing twice as fast. And I think if we get this tax cut done, I think we'll see potentially 4% growth in 2018.
You know, listen, we're nearly in the 10th year of a recovery cycle. Typically, recoveries last somewhere between 8 and 11 years. We're actually due for a recession. What the Trump plan is doing, what the Republicans are doing, is throwing kerosene on an overheated market. This money is going to go straight into back into the stock markets. Companies are going to buy up their own shares. It's going to enrich the C-suite. It's not going to create jobs on Main Street. It's certainly not going to create jobs in the communities that the president's been talking up. Also, I want to address Stephen's point about the global economy, and it's true. Look, we're living in a global economy. American companies have to compete, but we had a little exercise in the idea of what happens when you cut tax rates and then try and get monies from abroad and tax havens to come back and be reinvested. It doesn't go onto Main Street. It goes into the stock market. It does not help average people, and that's what's going to happen this time. We're going to end up with Wall Street and Main Street being even more divided than they are now.
All right, this conversation will continue. Thank you both. When we come right back, the strategy behind the Republicans' rush to pass this tax bill. Polls show the bill is incredibly unpopular. Should Republicans rethink passing a bill Americans don't want? Republican leaders in Congress vowing to get the tax bill to the president's desk for his signature by Christmas. Joining me now to discuss CNN political contributor, I should say, Maria Cardona, and a Democratic strategist, and political commentator Ed Martin, the author of The Conservative Case for Trump. Hello to both of you. Maria, I'm going to start with you. Republicans in the House and Senate, they've reached a deal on their tax bill. Is there even more pressure to pass this bill now, you think?
Oh, absolutely. After the huge loss that they suffered last night, I think that they're in a position where they desperately need to show that they can do anything. They haven't had any legislative wins other than the Supreme Court justice, and they are desperate to show their base that the Congress can do something, and that Trump, as President of the United States, who made so many promises on the campaign trail, can actually deliver something, since he has seen more than 3 losses legislatively this year, which have been politically damaging to him and his brand. The problem, though, moving forward is that this is an incredibly unpopular bill pushed by an incredibly unpopular president. And after last night and after the elections in November, Americans are rethinking Republicans, period, so Republicans should be rethinking this bill.
I haven't seen you this happy in a long time, and you said all of that with a smile on your face, Maria. I wonder what happened yesterday.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, Ed, listen, Chuck Schumer is calling on Republicans to delay the vote on their tax reform legislation until after the newly elected senator takes office or is seated. Here's what he said.
It would be wrong for Senate Republicans to jam through this tax bill without giving the newly elected senator from Alabama the opportunity to cast his vote.
So, if they did that, if Jones is in the Senate, they have a 51-member majority only. Is waiting the right thing to do?
Well, I don't know. When Chuck Schumer's calling for sort of civility, it just sort of makes me smile. But look, I think a bigger question, Maria and I actually agree on this. They want to jam it through because they want to show.
I said, is waiting the right thing to do?
I don't know if it's the right thing to do. I mean, they didn't do it on Obamacare. They didn't do it on. It depends on what your viewpoint. What I think is it's a bigger problem for Republicans when Donald Trump sells this bill as a tax cut, like he did today. I think the people in the country, especially conservatives, will agree, get competitive with China. But when you look at the details, as Maria said, they start to come out and it looks like a swampy mess. And I think it's going to be ugly for Republicans to defend. And actually, I think it's part of me thinks it's really dumb because it's not actually what we need right now. I think we need border security. We need, I'd raise taxes on imports, things like that. But we'll see what happens. It's going to be an interesting 10 days.
What about infrastructure over building a wall?
Yeah, well, I build a wall first and then do the roads too. But yeah, I'm for infrastructure too. I think, there's a fight right now in the Republican Party that looks like the establishment is winning because they want things like tax reform. And Trump didn't run on tax reform. He ran on something different. So some of us are nervous that the president's being sort of co-opted to some of the swampy ideas. But he sells it better than most, honestly,
Maria,
especially the competitiveness.
Maria, build a wall before tackling the nation's infrastructure?
Yeah, I mean, again, this underscores just how ridiculous and upside down the GOP's and Trump's priorities are. And you can see that in this tax bill where, in this tax bill, and I'm glad that Ed and I agree on this, it is a huge wet kiss to millionaires and billionaires and wealthy corporations. And, it's interesting that Republicans say, well, the economy is going gangbusters. Well, yeah, it is. Thank you, President Obama. So if it is going so well, why are we so desperate to give millionaires and billionaires and corporations a tax cut?
I don't understand why, well, maybe I do. Why the folks in the Trump administration won't admit that the economy was doing well under President Obama, that he had the worst recession since the Great Depression was coming out of that. And then I just keep wondering, when this president says he was handed a mess, if he had been handed the economy that Barack Obama was, it's just facts, I wonder if he would be crying.
Let's not even think that.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine? But listen, I want to get back to Chuck Schumer because this was a valid point. Schumer did cite the 2010 special Senate election in Massachusetts when Republican Scott Brown won, and as a precedent, because Democrats agreed back then to postpone their vote on the Affordable Care Act until Brown could be seated. Do you think Republicans will do the same here, Maria?
No, absolutely not, because they know.
Is that why Ed wouldn't answer?
Yes, I do think that's why Ed wouldn't answer. But I don't think, I know they won't do it. They've already said they're not going to do it because they're scared to have the American people have more time to look at exactly what's in this tax bill. And it will become even more unpopular than it is now. Don, if this tax bill passes, it will be the most deeply unpopular piece of legislation that has passed in 3 decades.
I think Ed agrees with you on that. Ed, do I think? Look, you think the GOP should be rethinking this? But quickly. On this specific point.
Yes, I sure do. I think they need to think about it a lot, about what happened yesterday, and wonder if it's going to be the right thing. But I think there's a lot of people that are wanting it and are going to push it through. So we're going to see what happens.
We're out of time. Thank you both. I appreciate it. We'll be right back.
Thanks, Don.
And it's always a great night, and the heroes are always great and special when they contribute to the world. Thank God that song is good, because I hear it over and over. I hear it in my sleep. So Andra Day, I love that song. That's it for us tonight. Thanks for watching. I'll see you right back here tomorrow.